Made for the South Pole. Book 7 in the Romance Island Resort series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 33. Why was she here? Oh, that's right. To stop him from falling in a hole again. Jean wanted to laugh. She was a far more dangerous distraction than any cushion plant, because if he fell into her hole, he'd never get out. He wouldn't even want to try. Outside, where it was cold and she'd have to keep her clothes on, he'd be able to concentrate better. In here, in such close quarters, it was a lot harder. While she heated up dinner at the tiny gas burner, he unrolled his sleeping bag on the bunk across from hers. The shelves above both beds that might have doubled as bunks if there'd been more people on the island, now held the bulk of their supplies. Including the pack of wet wipes he'd found her stroking down her body when he'd walked in earlier. He had to stop. This was doing his head in. Jean racked his brain for something, anything to take his mind off how much he wanted to take this woman to bed. To lie her down on his bunk and taste. Do you want me to tell you about what happened last time? Jean asked loudly, hoping to drown out his own thoughts. Audra glanced over her shoulder. Yes, please. So he did. He started with the cushion plant, the cave, then coming up in the middle of the cove and swimming ashore. Dragging himself into the apple hut and calling for help. Help that finally came in the form of herself. He left out two things that she didn't really need to know. First was the penguin population he'd thought he'd seen. There was a reason he'd been out alone that day, and he barely knew the woman. He definitely didn't trust her. The other, he wasn't sure why he didn't mention Darien. Maybe because it was more than a little embarrassing to admit that he'd used his ex-wife as the motivation he'd needed to live. Holding on to someone who didn't want him made him weak, and he didn't want Audra to think that. Or maybe it was because just thinking about his ex-wife or saying her name hurt so much. More weakness right there. That's why women didn't want him. They wanted some guy who'd step in and save them from everything, not someone who risked everything for a dream. Okay, I think it's ready. Audra divided the food into 2 bowls and handed him one. I hope it's not too hot. The pasta sent up a cloud of steam, but it smelled delicious, so Jean took the risk, which paid off. It tasted as good as it smelled, and the heat helped chase off some of the chill in his bones he hadn't even noticed until now. Audra sat with her bowl in her lap. If I understand your story correctly, there's probably only 2 things we need to do, in order to avoid a similar accident. She held up a finger. 1. We be careful around cushion plants. You'll have to point them out to me tomorrow, so I know what to watch out for. And 2. Neither of us leaves camp alone. Not even for a short walk. Jean wanted to argue about the alone bit, but with his mouth full, he just nodded. She wouldn't understand why he'd gone out looking for those penguins alone. The weather wasn't much of a secret, like a new species or a remarkable recovery from extinction would be. Besides, she wasn't a researcher. She had a science degree, sure, but she wasn't driven by the same passion to discover like he was. If he ever did settle down with a woman, he'd want her to share that passion. There had to be women researchers out there who were truly passionate about their work. Maybe one day he'd wind up on an island with a seal researcher or maybe even a marine biologist, and... What's your plan for tomorrow? Audra asked. Count penguins, like he intended to do every day for the next 4 weeks. Check out the king penguin population at Spit Point, he said. It wasn't as far, and he could sit in the boat, which would give his legs a rest after today. They'd already started aching, and tomorrow they'd be agony. Okay. How long will that take? He considered. A day. Maybe 2. I usually try to get each colony a few different times a day, over a couple of days if I can. It makes the count more accurate. Audra nodded. All right. Does it have to be 2 days in a row, or any 2 days while we're here? Any 2 days. And after that? There's meant to be a huge colony near Doppler Hill. If it's as big as the old reports say, we're looking at a week at least. Maybe more, depending on how long it takes to get out there. And then the same again for a second pass. We'll need to take the boat. Audra held up a hand. Wait. I think I remember Doppler Hill from one of last year's expedition maps. The geologists were studying the Stevenson Glacier, which runs down Big Ben, between us and the hill, and into the little meltwater lagoon at the bottom. They said they did it on foot. Are you saying they took a boat instead? I don't know, he admitted. I never made it that far south. We were supposed to come here after I was finished at Atlas Cove, but then I had that accident and… Everything went south, Audra finished for him with a smile. Yeah. Jean resumed eating his dinner. It looks like we should have enough time for all of it, even allowing for some days off for bad weather, which we're bound to get out here. Audra nodded, looking satisfied, then started eating. I thought you were supposed to control the weather. That's why you came along, right? Jean ventured. I wish. Then she laughed, and once again Jean couldn't take his eyes off her. If he believed in magic, he'd call her a witch, because every time she smiled or laughed, she had him enchanted. 34. Audra started the outboard motor and set off at a slow cruise, parallel to the shore. So, are you going to teach me a bit about penguins so I know what to look for? What do you want to know? Jean shouted back. Audra thought a moment. Well, why aren't we stopping to count those penguins, or those ones? There's dozens of them all the way along here, at least 2 different kinds, but you're not even looking at them, let alone asking me to stop. I thought you needed these numbers for your research. They're not king penguins, Jean said, pointing. The black and white ones over there are Gen 2 penguins. The ones with the bunches of yellow feathers on the sides of their heads are macaroni penguins. Not the right species. I'm only studying king penguins. Why? He looked surprised by the question. Slowly he answered, because they're different to all the others. He lifted his chin. Tell me what you know about penguins. Audra had to think about that one. They eat krill. Not king penguins. They like bigger fish and squid. Stuff that swims more than 100 meters below the surface. They're one of the deepest divers. They mate for life. Jean winced. Actually, king penguins don't. Especially if the chick doesn't survive. They find a new mate right away because they breed for most of the year. The dads look after the babies while the mums go fishing. King penguins share parenting. They have creches for the juveniles, but the babies go from mum's feet to dad's and back again. Audra racked her brain for something else. They like sitting on icebergs. She knew he was going to refute this one. All the penguins she'd pointed out were sitting on rock, not ice. King penguins avoid ice. Their colonies are all on rocky beaches at sub-Antarctic islands. And the juveniles camouflage better with the rock. I'll show you when we find the colony. They're endangered, especially by climate change, she said triumphantly. You'd be right for most penguin species, but not with king penguins. King penguins are flourishing, mostly because they were nearly wiped out by whalers and sealers. But they're not whales or seals. Why would they kill penguins? Audra demanded. Did you see those big, rusted cauldron things on the edge of camp, near the old wooden huts? Jean asked. When Audra nodded, he continued, those are tripods. They'd cut up whale and seal blubber and boil it down in those to get the oil. And they needed fuel for the fires. Did you notice there aren't any trees on the island? Audra hadn't, but a quick scan now told her this place was almost as barren of plant life as the mainland. All she saw were the brown and green mounds Jean had called cushion plants or azorella. Did they burn all the trees? Even as she said it, it didn't make sense. Unless the penguins had used the trees for something, but they didn't seem to miss them now. Especially if, like Jean said, they were recovering. Jean laughed. Everyone says that. No. Hydrocarbons are a much better fuel than wood. Penguins have a lot of fat on them, so they used to feed the fire with the biggest penguins they could find, king penguins. Oh no. That's horrible. Tell me you're joking, Audra demanded. Jean shook his head. I wish I were. Like I said, they nearly died out. Now they're not being used as firewood, the populations are recovering. That's why I'm out here counting birds and comparing it to the satellite photos. I've already submitted 2 papers. That's why I was too busy to socialize on the ship. He sounded bitter. Now Audra felt even worse for criticizing him about it earlier. Not to mention it was kind of cool how he was following one of the few species that weren't dying out. She opened her mouth to apologize. Stop the boat. Jean shouted. Those are king penguins and we need to count them, photograph them and count them again. Especially the babies in the middle. Ready? Audra shut off the motor and dropped the anchor. The water was so clear she saw it clunk to the rocks below. She pulled out her camera. I'm ready. 35. Jean clambered stiffly out of the Zodiac, tired and hurting but happy. The last population estimates for the Spit Point colony were around 150 pairs, but both he and Audra had counted over 200 on both trips. Judging by the number of juveniles, there were still a few adults out fishing too, which could push the number higher still. He'd have to check his notes to make some estimates, but it was possible that this colony had doubled in size since the last survey. That kind of population growth was just unheard of. A finding like that was a paper all on its own, even before he'd made it out to Doppler Hill or Atlas Cove. The walk up the beach to the hut was nothing short of torture. All of yesterday's bumps and bruises had grown into a bone-deep ache, pretty much from the waist down. Probably a good thing the only action he'd get for a while would be in his dreams, if last night was any indication. He glanced at Audra. Penguins would fly before he told her how she'd sat astride him naked in last night's best dream. He'd have to wait until she used the bathroom so he could take some pain pills to take the edge off again. He hadn't brought the strong ones he'd taken at Christmas, which were probably what he needed right now, but the hangover afterwards just wasn't worth it. Not when he had field work to do. As they reached camp, Audra said, "You get started with dinner. I'll be with you in a minute." Jean hot-footed it into the hut, determined to get the pills down his throat before she was done in the bathroom. Then he could make dinner. When Audra cracked open the door, he had a pot of water heating on the stove, and his head down in a box of supplies from McMurdo. We ate the last of the bread with lunch, so it's field rations all the way from here on in. Which do you want, the chicken pasta or some sort of lamb curry? Curry, Audra said instantly. She craned her neck to read the package. Does it come with rice, or do I need to find some? Jean flipped the package over. No rice. But I think I saw some in the bottom, under the chocolate. Audra perked up. Chocolate. It's the good stuff from New Zealand too. I spent months recovering in Christchurch, and the one thing I remember most is the chocolate. He grabbed a bar for himself and tossed one to Audra. Beats Hershey's. Beats what? Audra mumbled with her mouth full. Don't you have Hershey's chocolate in Australia? Audra shrugged. I think we might have it in the gourmet shops. The chocolate and the ice cream syrup and every kind of Pop-Tart they don't make at home. Expensive though. I don't think I've ever had it. Cadbury's was good enough for us. She tapped the bar she'd nearly finished. "This is good." Jean felt his pain start to ebb as the water boiled, so he could walk over to the stove with barely a hint of a limp. He added water to their dehydrated meals and sat down to wait. At least it beat cooking and doing dishes afterwards. They ate in silence. Audra because she seemed to be savoring the spicy food, and him because he had to alternate between curry, rice and big gulps of water. Next time he'd pick dinner, and he'd make sure it was something that wouldn't set his tonsils on fire. Audra finished first. "I'll just boil some water for tea before I turn the gas off for the night." Jean nodded, struggling to finish his food when all he wanted was to record his results and make a start on that paper. The desire to work won out, and he stretched out on his bunk, tapping away at his tablet. He wasn't sure how much time passed before he heard someone calling his name. "M.M.," he said without looking up. "I asked if you wanted some tea." Jean shook his head and kept working. He was interrupted by a cup shoved between his face and the screen, full of something that steamed and smelled of flowers. "What's this?" "Tea." "I said I didn't want any." Audra didn't move the cup out of the way. "It's a sleep tea. Helps you relax, which might help with those nightmares you keep having." Jean jerked his head up so he could meet her knowing eyes. "I don't have nightmares." "If you say so, but you sure are restless at night." Rather than tell her what had kept him up last night, Jean grabbed the tea and took a cautious sip. It tasted of flowers and not much else. "Thanks." He didn't remember finishing the tea until Audra reached in front of him to take the empty cup away. He was too intent on getting his thoughts down about the paper before he forgot. "Are we going out to Doppler Hill tomorrow?" she asked. "Yeah," he replied. "Then lights out in 5 minutes. We both need sleep, as we'll have to hike across the glacier." Once again he met her resolute gaze. "You're not my mother." "Thank the universe for that." Audra laughed. "Nope. I'm something worse. Your expedition leader and the safety officer. Our safety tomorrow depends on both of us being well rested and alert. I will confiscate whatever I have to in order to keep us both safe. You're not breaking your leg again on my watch, bird boy." She dropped something heavy onto the bunk beside him. "And this is for you." Jean picked up the hot water bottle. "I don't need this," he lied as welcome warmth spread through his fingers. If anything could soothe the ache in his legs, it was this, but he didn't dare admit his weakness to her. "Which pain meds are you taking then?" Audra proceeded to list the name of every pill he'd brought with him. Jean clamped his mouth shut and shook his head. "We both know that's bullshit. You've been limping since yesterday and now you're not. Tell me which ones you've taken or I'll go through your bags. I will drug test you, Jane, if I think you've taken something that compromises the safety of this expedition." Glowering, he dug out the pill package and held it out to her. Audra read the box, nodded once, then handed it back to him. "What about the ones you were taking at Christmas? Did you bring those?" she demanded. Jean sagged. "No. I stopped taking them before New Year's." He had to ask. "Are you going to report me for them?" "Your name was on the prescription label on the box, so I presume they were legally yours, just like the ones you took tonight." Cautiously, Jean nodded. Audra took a deep breath. "If I have to choose between working alongside a man who's exhausted and has slower response times because he's in constant pain, or one who's taking pain medication that I know about and can compensate for, I'll pick the second. It takes an incredible amount of guts to come back here after what happened to you last time. I mean, I saw what state you were in. Which is why I can't let it happen again, and why I'm willing to help you now. You're a bloody trooper, Jane." The way she said it sounded like a compliment. "Thanks," he said awkwardly. Now accept the bloody hot water bottle, or I'll wait until you're asleep and shove it into your sleeping bag with you. Audra inside his sleeping bag. Now that would be interesting. Jean grinned. Yes ma'am, he said. 36. Jean stretched out on his bunk, lifting his tablet in front of his face so he could reread the chapter he'd written on Heard Island. The only thing missing from his thesis now was the elusive Atlas Cove rookery. So what did you think of dinner? Audra asked. It had been her turn to make it, and Jean had dutifully eaten it, though his was all gone now. He couldn't even remember what it tasted like. He couldn't say that though. She laughed. We're a pair, aren't we? The rest of the world is celebrating Valentine's Day with their nearest and dearest, or the people they'd like to be, yet here we are, on an island so isolated that it may as well be a secret known only to penguins and seals. Working. She waved at her open laptop. Valentine's Day? Jean checked the date on his tablet. That meant they'd only been on Heard Island for 3 weeks. It felt like longer. They'd surveyed both Spitpoint and Doppler Hill colonies, set up Audra's weather station, and they still had a week to spare. Yes, Valentine's Day, Audra said. You know, when couples get all romantic? Jean shrugged. I've never really done much for Valentine's Day. It's just a big commercial stunt, to get people to spend more money on stuff they don't need. Flowers. Chocolates. Greeting cards. Fancy food. Pointless really. That had always been Darren's opinion, and Jean had agreed with her. Flowers and cards might be a bit over the top, but I draw the line at fancy food and chocolate. If you didn't enjoy the mango chicken as much as I did, I'll keep the rest for myself. And as for the Tim Tams, good luck getting any of those out of me. Audra brandished the cookie package. Now that's harsh. Those rations are for both of us. Jean had grown quite fond of the Australian cookies, which Audra usually shared. What'll you trade me for them, bird boy? Jean considered for a moment before he said, I have a bottle of whiskey from home that I plan to drink once my work here was done. We're finished with our field work here earlier than scheduled. That's worth celebrating for sure, even if we still have the survey at Atlas Cove still to go. Worth a glass or two now though. Audra wet her lips. You know, I've been thinking about Atlas Cove. I'm supposed to set up the second weather station there. I know we're meant to wait for the investigator to return and transport all our equipment up there in a week or two, but it looks to me like there's already a camp up there we could use. If we loaded a Zodiac with all the bare essentials and picked a calm day, we could make it up there by ourselves. Even if it's too rough to head back, we could just radio the investigator to pick us up there instead of here. By all accounts, it's a more sheltered anchorage out there. What do you think? Jean wanted to hug her. More than anything, he wanted to find those Wharf Point penguins. He knew he hadn't imagined them. I think it's a great idea, he said. There is a hut there, and we made sure everything was operational last year. We'd need food, water, fuel and our packs. That's it, really. As long as the weather's good, but I'll leave that in your capable hands. It was a standing joke between them that, despite her protestations to the contrary, Audra did actually control the weather, because they'd only lost 1 day to bad weather in the entire 3 weeks. She looked surprised. You're brave to go back there after what happened last time. Are you sure? No. He wasn't brave. It wasn't courage driving him at all, but the desire for adventure. To discover. To be the first. In one of the expeditions a few years back, there's an unconfirmed report about king penguins breeding at Wharf Point, where they've never been seen before. A new colony would show that they're not just recovering, but expanding. I was trying to get a good view of their beach last year when I had the accident. Audra nodded knowingly. So that's why you came back. You want to discover something no one else has seen before and share it with the world. They're your penguins, just like these are my weather stations. And here I thought you were just some ex-military survivor type, trained to survive, no matter what. Instead, you're a scientist in the truest sense of the word. Like the early explorers who came out here, risking their lives to discover, or the most dedicated medical scientists, injecting themselves with diseases so they can prove their vaccine works. We'll get to Atlas Cove, and if your penguins are there, I'll help you find them. Jean's eyes met hers. She did understand. Like few people ever could, and no woman he'd ever met. More than ever, now he understood why everyone she worked with seemed to sing her praises. He'd officially joined the choir. He didn't want to sing right now, though. Instead, he experienced the overpowering desire to kiss her. I better pour that whiskey, he said. He found 2 cups and poured them each a measure. Audra cautiously sniffed at her cup. It doesn't smell like any whiskey I've had before. And you drink it straight? It's cinnamon whiskey. It comes from Canada, but we managed to convince enough Americans to try it, that now you can buy it pretty much everywhere in the States too. Try it. You'll like it. They both lifted their cups. To the Atlas Cove expedition, Audra said. They both drank. Jean felt the familiar burn coat the back of his throat, but Audra erupted in a coughing fit. Oh God! I don't know how you can drink this straight. It's like setting fire to your whiskey and drinking it while it's still ablaze, she rasped. Give me a mango beer any day. That might mix quite well with this, Jean said. I got a 6-pack for Christmas that I haven't opened. We can try it when we get back to Davis. Ugh! Audra ripped open the cookie package. I'm going to need these to get the taste out of my mouth. She bit off the end off a cookie, then stared at it a moment before she turned it around and bit the other end off. Jean had seen other Aussies do this with coffee, but this wasn't the same. Wait, don't. Audra dunked the cookie in her cup and wrapped her lips around one end, like the cookie was a giant straw. She gave an enormous slurp before her eyes widened in surprise. Well, it's better than drinking the stuff straight, she said, blinking. She leaned in to suck on the cookie again. I should try that, he found himself saying. Anything to get the image of her blissfully sucking, her lips wrapped around. Jean shook his head and bit down on his own cookie, then dropped it into his own drink. Oh shit! Audra laughed at him and reached over to help him fish it out at the same time as he did. Their fingers tangled in the cup, and warmth spread through Jean's whole body at the contact. He stared at her. You have chocolate on your nose, he said, wanting to wipe it away. No, he wanted to lick it away. A blush colored her cheeks, like she could read his mind. Her fingers tightened around his. Jean, He kissed her. Softly at first, as her lips melted against his, then with more passion as he tasted chocolate and whiskey and her. The perfect woman for him. The one he wanted more than anything. The one whose lips parted as she kissed him just as desperately as he kissed her. Jean reached out to pull her close. Now he had her, he never wanted to let go. 37. One moment she had her hand stuck with his inside a cup, the next she was kissing Jean like her life depended on it. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like she wanted to climb into his lap, tear his clothes off and have her way with him. Strong arms closed around her, reminding her of the day they first met. The day she'd found out he had a wife. Oh God! She was kissing a married man. That made her almost as bad as him. Audra wrenched herself away from Jean, backing up until her back hit the wall of the tiny hut. She was still breathing hard and her heart beat so fast it was thrumming in her chest. Out of passion for a married man who was cheating on his wife. Don't you ever do that again, Audra said, her voice shaking with fury. She stormed out of the hut, or tried to, but her foot caught on something. She managed not to fall over though, so she kicked the obstacle out of her way and continued out without another word. For what felt like hours, she marched up and down the beach, mad at Jean and even more angry at herself. She was as bad as Jay. Worse than Jay. He might have cheated on her, but he'd never seduced someone he knew was married. When she crept back inside the hut, the smell of whiskey was almost overpowering. Audra's foot clinked against the empty bottle which had fallen on its side. Had he drunk the whole thing while she was outside? Judging by the snoring coming from his bunk, he most certainly had. Fine. He could nurse his hangover all the way to Atlas Cove tomorrow. She'd forgotten to tell him that the forecast was perfect for their boat trip tomorrow morning, but now it was a fitting revenge for the cheating bastard. 38. When Jean woke the next morning, Audra still wasn't there. A kettle steamed on the stove though, and several casks of water were missing. Had she left without him? Bitch. He stumbled out of the hut and breathed a sigh of relief when he spotted the Zodiac still on the beach. She'd loaded it with boxes of supplies and the water casks, and was now wrestling a gas bottle over the side. A fuel drum sat on the beach, waiting its turn. "We leave in 20 minutes, so hurry up," she shouted. Jean didn't need telling twice. He hurried back inside to pack his things, wrinkling his nose at the whiskey fumes inside. No wonder he had a headache, breathing that in all night. After she'd changed her mind about wanting to kiss him, she'd kicked over the bottle in her haste to get outside. By the time Jean had gotten to it, the bottle was empty. So much for celebrating when they found his penguins. Now he hated Valentine's Day more than anything. He shoved his sleeping bag on top of everything else in his pack, not bothering to check how many ration packs he had in there. He knew they'd have enough, he hadn't touched them since he'd arrived. Next, he poured some hot water in one of the dehydrated breakfast pouches and made himself a coffee while his breakfast was doing its thing. Audra slammed the door open and grabbed her pack. "Are you coming or what?" Jean shouldered his pack, seized his coffee in one hand and his breakfast in the other, and followed her to the beach. He managed to burn his mouth on the coffee, trying to drink it all before he needed both hands to help Audra load the boat. It seemed she'd packed everything though, including the fuel drum. Superwoman. He should never have kissed her. Should have kept his distance and satisfied himself with just dreaming about her until his job here was done. Now, he might have put the last part of his field work in jeopardy. "We are still going to Atlas Cove, right?" he ventured. "Of course," she shot back. "Did you drink so much last night that you forgot?" That shut him up. She'd had more alcohol than he had, before she'd kicked over the bottle so he couldn't drink any more. The waves were headed northwest, the same direction they were going, so the trip was a lot smoother than Jean expected. Audra's thunderous expression had turned into one of intense concentration, but he figured if he didn't want her to kill him, he was still better off not talking to her. He tried to keep his eyes off the water below them, turning his gaze instead on the coastline as they zoomed past. Glaciers cascaded off Big Ben like frozen waterfalls down to the sea. The mountain's peak was shrouded in cloud again today, making it look like the volcano was actually erupting. It wasn't, of course. Jean had asked the geologists last trip, who'd laughed and told him he'd know from the earthquakes that the volcano was stirring long before anything came out the top. So he was back to worrying about the water, which would be just as cold as the last time he'd been here in Atlas Cove. His breath caught in his throat as they rounded Wharf Point. The memory was too strong after going over it so many times in his nightmares. This was where he'd nearly died. Where it could all happen again. Jean didn't open his eyes until he felt the bottom of the boat scrape against the beach. "Give me a hand, will you? I need to secure the boat so we can unload it," Audra snapped. Jean nodded, turning his back on the water to do what was necessary. He could do this. He could, he told himself. He carried their gear up to the apple hut that was still a hazy part of his dreams, still repeating his mantra in his mind. I want to get the uplink set up today, so I can start data collection in the morning. Are we good to do penguin hunting tomorrow after we set up the weather station? Audra asked. Once again Jean nodded. He needed to get his head straight on task, and right now he wasn't sure he could face the Azorella Peninsula. Maybe if he took the boat, he'd be able to get close enough to the penguins to get an idea of whether there really was a population here, and return with Audra on the land side of the bay. Tomorrow, he told himself. 39. Jean had barely said a word to her for all of yesterday and most of this morning, so Audra was surprised to hear the boat engine fire up. She stumbled out of the hut just in time to see Jean headed out into the cove. You better not be leaving without me, she shouted. He hollered back something about penguins, pointing across the cove. Of course. That new penguin colony he'd been so eager to find until yesterday, when he'd agreed to help her with her weather station first. So much for that idea. Selfish prick. A quick peep inside the hut told her he'd left most of his gear behind, so at least he'd be coming back. That left her alone to her own devices, but that wasn't such a bad thing. Her instructions were to find an elevated position near the western camp to install the second weather station, and she knew just the spot, on the little peninsula just north of camp. The Azorella Peninsula, her map said, named for the cushion plants all over it. It would be best to set up her station as close as possible to one of the spots where earlier expeditions had taken their observations, Shelley had told her, though Audra had already planned to do that. If she won the Bureau's contest, she could do her doctorate out here, collating all the new weather data and comparing it to past observations, to see if anything had changed. But first, she had to win that contest, which meant kicking things up a notch. Her videos were getting more views, a few hundred each, but she wanted to try live streaming again. The satellite uplink was securely fixed to the roof of the hut. Her laptop was connected to the internet via the uplink, and her camera fed everything it filmed direct to her laptop. Now was the time to see if it worked. She grabbed the weather station and strapped her camera to her wrist. Audra paused to zip her coat up properly as she stepped outside, then marched with her head held high to the hill above the camp. From her vantage point, she could see Jean's boat cruising just offshore, maybe 100 meters up the bay. She hoped he found his penguins. Audra set to work, assembling the weather station like the expert she now was. It only took her a few minutes, leaving plenty of time to do that video. Audra summoned a smile and turned on the camera. Hi. Welcome back to Heard Island. If you're watching this now, it means I've succeeded in doing a live video. If you're watching this later, I guess I need to work on that live bit. I have an excuse though, just check out the view. She panned the camera around slowly, pointing out Big Ben, the camp, the cove, and even Jean. She lifted a hand to wave at him while the camera was pointed in his direction, and he pointed back at her and shouted something she couldn't hear. Ah well. If he'd wanted to tell her something, he shouldn't have given her the silent treatment this morning. Or maybe he was so excited about finding his penguins that he wanted to share the excitement with her, as the only other person on the island. I think our biologist has found some very special penguins he's been searching for, so let's take a look and see if we can spot them too. Audra turned the camera to the shore below her, where there were plenty of penguins and seals sunning themselves between the tumbled rocks. All adult penguins though, and she knew Jean had been looking for babies. Audra glimpsed movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned to face what she thought she'd seen, she found only more rocks. And then, one of the rocks moved and opened its beak. Audra blinked. Not rocks at all, but brown penguins, the very same that Jean had been looking for. No wonder he was so excited. She counted them out loud for the camera, telling what was probably one sole viewer about how juvenile king penguins were originally thought to be a completely different species to their parents, because they looked so different to the tiny gray babies or their majestic black, white and gold parents. A sudden shiver ran through her, as though a goose had walked over her grave. It wasn't like she was cold or scared. It was followed by another shudder, as Audra realized the rock beneath her was moving too. She remembered Jean's warning about sinkholes, so she backed up toward the concrete pad with a row of squat support pillars along one side, which was all that remained of an old research camp that had probably been abandoned before she was born. That bit had to be stable. Audra reached the concrete safely, then turned the camera on herself. "Sorry about that. I'm standing on an active volcano and Big Ben behind me is grumbling a bit, making the earth move." The ground shook again, illustrating her point for her. "But it's all right, this volcano hardly ever erupts. See?" Audra turned to face the peak, lifting the camera higher. Even as she watched, a curl of smoke issued from the mountain. "Well, now don't I feel silly? A mountain making a liar out of me. It's only smoking though." Above, a gray avalanche thundered down the side of the mountain, before it spent itself in the snow. An eruption. A real volcanic eruption. She hadn't just seen it, she'd caught the rare event on film. If she was lucky, one of the news channels would pick up her video because of this. "Wow," Audra managed to say. "You just saw Big Ben erupt. I hope I'm safe down here." The ground beneath her feet bucked, throwing Audra off balance. She tried to steady herself, but she might as well have been standing on jelly and not concrete. All she could do was put her arms out to break her fall. She landed hard against one of the concrete pillars. Hard enough to feel the sickening snap as it broke her arm. Audra couldn't help it. She let out an agonized scream. 40. Jean scanned the far shore, searching for the penguins he knew he'd spotted last time. Even with his binoculars, he couldn't be sure if they were king penguins or not, and the chicks blended into the rocks so well he'd need to be a lot closer to spot them. He considered asking for Audra's help. 2 pairs of eyes were better than one, but she'd barely spoken to him since that misguided kiss. She'd been playing with him for her own reasons, Jean decided. She didn't care about him or his research, and she wouldn't help him now. So he set off alone in the boat, trying not to think about how cold the sea was beneath him. If he did, he'd head right back to shore. What kind of man was afraid of a bit of cold water? Audra would laugh at him if she knew. Jean glanced back at the camp, where she stood on the beach, waving her arms and shouting something he couldn't hear. "I'm going to find my penguins," he shouted back, stabbing a finger in the direction of what he hoped was the new colony. "And don't think you can stop me," he added to himself, turning his back on her. He pulled on his balaclava, not wanting to wear a scarf across this face that might come loose in the wind. He needed both hands free to hand the boat and his binoculars. When he next looked, she wasn't standing on the beach anymore. Instead, he saw a red-coated figure climbing the ridge above the camp that led to the Azorella Peninsula, where that plant had nearly killed him. He watched her with his heart in his throat, dreading the moment when she too took a wrong step. It was just like the woman to find the surest way to distract him from his search, by putting herself in danger of breaking both her legs like he had. If she expected him to follow her and drag her back to camp, she was sorely mistaken. She knew the risks of venturing into the old lava field. Sinkholes, lava tubes, and who knew what else lurked there, ready to trap the unwary. The whole island was an active volcano. It almost looked like it was smoking this morning, but it was probably just cloud. Jean raised his binoculars to get a closer look at the cloud at the peak, and his blood ran cold. Through the lenses he could see gray smoke billowing up, and what looked like ash or small pieces of rock landing on the snow. He had to warn her, at least. But she disappeared from sight. Jean waited for a long moment, hoping and praying that she'd reappear so he wouldn't have to go after her. After what seemed like an eternity, she appeared at the highest point of the ridge, waving cheerfully at him. Crazy woman, he muttered, then cupped his hands to his mouth to shout a warning about Big Ben. She just smiled and waved, then peered down at the rocky beach, ignoring him and the volcano. Swearing, Jean followed her line of sight to a cluster of penguins. King penguins. He brought the boat in closer, hardly daring to hope that he'd found the colony at last. First he saw a dozen penguins, then he rounded a particularly large piece of volcanic rock, and his breath caught in his throat. Not a dozen. Hundreds of them. Far too many to be just a group out fishing. Jean raised his eyes to the ridge, wanting to shout his thanks to Audra, but she'd evidently grown some sense and headed for somewhere safer. Good. That left him free to count the penguins, take some pictures, and maybe even get close enough to see if they kept a creche of babies sheltered behind them. Just a little further. Audra screamed. Jean gritted his teeth. She'd probably just seen a spider, he seethed. This was his last chance to find his penguin colony and finish his PhD research, with the kind of results any biologist would die for. A biologist who knew damn well there weren't any spiders in Antarctica. What if she'd fallen into a sinkhole like he had? That's what had ended his research trip last time, Jean reminded himself angrily. This was his last chance. But what if she'd hit her head? Or lost consciousness, which is why she'd only screamed once? Jean's mouth went dry. Could he sentence a woman to die just so that he could satisfy his own ego, chasing a bunch of smelly birds? Worse, letting her die the same way he nearly did in his nightmares? Jean swallowed. Fuck the penguins. Audra's life mattered more than they did. He threw the boat into a 90-degree turn, running it aground on a rock near the penguins. He leaped out, set on only one thing, saving Audra. Penguins shuffled out of his way as he sprinted across the rocky beach, until he reached the end of their territory. He scrambled up the slope, nearly falling several times, doing his best to avoid the treacherous cushion plants. When he reached the ridge he couldn't see her, confirming his worst fears. Audra, he shouted. Audra, can you hear me? Where are you? He caught a glimpse of movement, as a red sleeve waved among the ruins of an earlier campsite halfway up the next rise. If she was anything less than critically injured, he was going to drag her down to the boat to finish the penguin survey with him. He strode up the slope, keeping his breath to fuel his furious pace. He had to skirt around the concrete pad to see her properly, where she lay hidden behind the supports of some long-gone structure. When he reached her, he stopped dead. The pain on her tear-streaked face was unmistakable. She might not have fallen down a sinkhole, but she'd still managed to injure herself. From the fearful look in her eyes, she'd already gone into shock. He wouldn't get anything coherent out of her. He'd have to get her back to camp, where there was food, warmth and a first aid kit. There he'd assess her injuries and radio for help. He leaned down and scooped her up. She was surprisingly light in his arms. No, she said, then swallowed. Please. Please, you're hurting me. 41. Her throat raw from screaming, Audra didn't trust her voice. And she definitely didn't want any more pain. The white-hot throbbing in her arm was bad enough. Jean lifted her up, bumping her arm and sending a fresh bolt of agony all the way up to her brain. No, don't, Audra tried to say, but hardly any sound came out. Please don't, you're hurting me. She reached for her useless right arm, pulling it across her body to support the broken limb. A red light blinked on her wrist. With her good arm, Audra switched off the camera, which had miraculously survived the fall unscathed. She ripped the Velcro strap off her wrist and cradled the camera to her chest beside her injured arm. All right. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly in an attempt to ignore the pain. How could anything hurt this much? Audra was grateful to Jean for carrying her, as she wasn't sure she could stay on her feet without falling to her knees and sobbing every few steps. How had Jean done it? Gotten himself from here to the hut with 2 broken legs? Her legs were fine and she was worse than useless. Relax. I'm taking you back to camp so I can help you. I've had the same first aid training as you, so I'll be taking just as good care of you as you would of me, Jean said softly in the sort of tone she'd use to a frightened puppy. And it worked. She did relax, secure in his arms as he carried her back to the hut. When they reached the beach, she saw the boat bobbing in the middle of the cove. He'd have to swim out to get it. She lifted her good arm to point it out to him, and the camera slipped from her hand. A sharp clack told her it had fallen on the rocks underfoot. Wait, she rasped. Need to pick it up. Jean dipped low, supporting her body on his knees as he crouched to retrieve it. I'll put it in my pocket to keep it safe, he said. Audra nodded. She wanted to tell him about the footage she'd taken of his baby penguins, but as she opened her mouth to speak, Jean rose awkwardly to his feet and the movement made the pain in her arm stab her all over again. She cried out, unable to form words anymore. I know it hurts. I'll get you back to camp so I can help you, Jean said, starting forward. His every step jolted her, until the pain became a steady throb to the beat of his boots. It would only hurt worse if she had to walk though. Tears flowed down her cheeks, but she didn't care anymore. As long as they didn't freeze, nothing mattered but making the pain end. After an eternity, they reached the hut. Jean took his time opening the door, but he didn't seem to want to put her down to use both hands either. Finally he got it open and carried her inside, then set her on the floor between their bunks. Okay, can you tell me where it hurts? Jean asked, patting down her legs. Audra felt the strangest desire to laugh at him for using this as an excuse to feel her up. My arm's broken, she said, pointing. That's all? She glared at him. It hurts like hell. Isn't that enough for you? He almost smiled. You sure you're that badly hurt if you can make jokes like that? Audra struggled to sit up so she could unzip her coat and extract her injured arm to show him. Do you think I'm bullshitting now? His eyes widened in shock. No. When I broke my legs and radioed for help, one of the guys asked me something and I replied with a joke. I was already half gone on morphine, I think. That's what he said. That I couldn't be badly hurt if... She didn't have the patience for his rambling. Find me something I can use to splint this. She scanned the hut. There. One of those things should do. She pointed at a box of foot-long plastic strips, the sort she'd seen the geologists use as markers. The plastic had a slight curve and was a bit longer than she needed, but should be rigid enough to give her arm some support. You'll need a bandage to secure that, Jean said, handing the piece of plastic to her. So find me a first aid kit. There should be one in your field pack, or mine if you forgot yours. It wouldn't surprise her if he had. Jean wasn't big on safety and it showed. Her broken arm wasn't his fault though. There's a bigger one under your bunk. 30 years worth of bandages. He reached into the storage cubby beneath her bed and pulled out the box, showing her the faded cross on top. See? She saw. Grabbing a couple of rolls of wide bandage, she ripped open the first package and set to work, wrapping it around her arm and the makeshift splint. Shouldn't I be doing that? I'm qualified in first aid, you know, Jean said. I'm fine, Audra bit out through her gritted teeth. Bloody hell, but it hurt. More tears leaked down her cheeks, so she bowed her head to hide them from Jean. She was nearly done. Jean didn't take his eyes off Audra. You know, I think there might be something here to take the edge off the pain. I remember another bottle of morphine in among the bandages. Audra breathed a sigh of relief as she tucked in the end of the bandage. Drained, she lay down while Jean rummaged through the first aid kit. Got it, he said. Now, I need to know your weight for the correct dosage. And don't you even think about lying about it. I carried you halfway around the cove, so I'll know if you take a few pounds off the total. But I'll give you the dose for the lower weight, which means it won't be as strong as if you'd told the truth. She'd probably lost weight out here, what with all the exercise she got trekking around the island, but Audra named the weight she'd been the last time she set foot on some scales. Jean prepared the syringe with practiced ease. Of course. He'd practiced on himself, probably in this very hut, when he'd been in a lot more pain than she was now. Where do you want it? He asked. Audra eyed the needle. If it was anyone else administering the injection, she'd take it in the thigh, but this was Jean. The man who'd grabbed her and tried to force her into bed the day they met, but also the man she'd shared sleeping quarters with for months without him doing anything untoward. Unless she counted that misguided kiss the other night, but there had been extenuating circumstances. And alcohol. She turned her gaze on Jean. Did she trust him? He offered a watery smile. Funny how the world works. I'm back here holding a syringe of morphine, but this time it's you who needs it, not me. Who'd have thought I'd ever get the chance to pay you back properly for what you did on the ship? No way was she taking a sedative from Jean. I'm fine, she said hoarsely. It doesn't hurt. I'll be fine until the boat comes to pick us up. You should call them. You can't be serious. Call them or I'll stab you again with this needle. She wouldn't, but she glared at him with all the fierceness she could muster, so he believed she would. Yes, ma'am. Jean crossed the hut and flicked on the radio. Investigator, this is Jean Pennant on Heard Island. What is your ETA at Atlas Cove? The radio crackled. Pennant? What are you doing at Atlas Cove? Aren't you supposed to be at the camp at Spit Bay? I felt like taking the boat for a spin. You're crazy, you know that? Yes, Jean replied blithely. But what's your ETA? A week. Audra's eyes met Jean's. No way was she enduring this sort of agony for a week. Jean wet his lips. What if I told you we have an injury that requires urgent medical attention? A pause where only hissing static filled the airwaves, followed by, if you've broken your legs again, I think the research leader here will break your arms too for cutting his research short. But only if his PhD students don't get to you first. The volcano's erupting and they want to study it. We know. Audra fell during one of the earth tremors. She's the one who's injured. Audra. The Met? Yes. More static. We're 3 days from your location. I'll give you a better estimate when you radio for your next check-in. Over and out. Audra ripped open a sterile wipe, yanked down the shoulder of her shirt and swabbed her arm. It was broken anyway. A little needle wouldn't make it hurt any worse. She took a deep breath. As she exhaled, she eased the needle into her arm, emptying the syringe into her flesh. There. Now she couldn't change her mind because the drug was already circulating in her bloodstream. She dropped the syringe back into its packaging and pressed a gauze pad to her arm to stem the tiny trickle of blood. With difficulty, she struggled to her feet. She took 2 steps before she collapsed on her bunk, just as she'd intended. It was harder to get herself out of her outer gear and into her sleeping bag with only one arm, but she managed it. Audra turned to fix Jean with her stare. Promise me you won't hurt me. Once that stuff kicks in, I promise you won't feel a thing, he assured her. Not good enough. Audra shook her head. Promise you won't hurt me. Promise you won't touch me. Hurt filled his eyes. Because she'd guessed his intentions, or because she'd wounded him by suspecting he'd touch her without her permission? What if you have a bad reaction to the drugs, or you have some sort of infection, or need another dose? He asked, swallowing. Promise you won't touch me unless there is a genuine medical emergency, and I will die if you don't, Audra amended. She could feel the lassitude sweeping through her. She understood how people got addicted to this stuff. It made her feel fluffy. "I swear to you I won't touch you unless your life depends on it." Jean settled on his bunk. "But I will watch over you until the ship arrives with a medic who can set that arm properly." "Thank you." The staring competition continued until Audra's eyelids weighed so heavily that they closed of their own accord. 42. Never in his life had Jean had so much trouble keeping still, but he did it. Every second he stared at her, lying on the opposite bunk, he just wanted to take her in his arms and swear to her that everything would be okay. That he'd take care of her. But he was a man of his word, and he'd promised not to touch her. So he sat on his own bunk while his brain buzzed with questions and kept his hands to himself. What did she think he'd do to her? He'd carried her for more than half a mile. His arms ached at the effort, but he wasn't complaining. He'd felt worse. He'd done worse, dragging his own body along the same beach. That's why he'd done it, he told himself. Because of his own bad experience, he wasn't willing to let someone else endure the same pain. Even if she had tried to seduce him away from his work. Jean shook his head. No, she hadn't. Her words just now confirmed it, while her fear-filled eyes demanded his answer. She didn't want him to touch her. Was that why she jerked away from that kiss the other night? She hadn't been teasing him, playing hard to get, pretending to reject him when he knew damn well she'd wanted that kiss as much as he had. She'd responded with more passion than he'd expected after all. And then she'd panicked and told him not to touch her. So who had touched her in such a way that made her terrified of men? Jean wanted to pound the asshole into a crater. A crevasse. And then bury him so deep he was a corpse by the time anyone dug him out. Because it had to be a man. Some asshole had hurt her, and when he found out who. Because it wouldn't be a stranger. Jean knew that much about rapists and cowards who hit women. Most of them knew their victims, which meant whoever he was, Audra knew him, or she thought she had. He opened his mouth to ask her, but while he'd been lost in thought, she'd succumbed to the morphine. Good. That meant she wasn't in any pain, at least for a little while. She might have told someone. A trusted friend, perhaps. The rock star she talked to online? He crossed the hut to the shelf where her laptop sat, open. At a touch, it woke up. She'd been working on it before she went for her walk, and forgotten to switch it off. The internet icon at the bottom blinked from offline to on. Internet access? Out here? How on earth had she managed that? They were miles from the Spit Bay camp. He shot her an admiring glance. For a meteorologist, she sure knew about a lot more than just the weather. The laptop chimed, telling him a video call was incoming. He swiped the screen, trying to reject the call before it could wake up Audra, but a picture of the rock star appeared instead. Fuck. Audra. Are you okay? Tell me you're okay, the Aussie demanded. She's sleeping, Jean said. He took a deep breath and made a decision. Look, it's just us at the camp, and when I tried to do first aid, she wouldn't let me touch her. Do you know if someone's hurt her in the past? Who the fuck are you? And what have you done to her? I haven't done anything. Jean protested. She wouldn't let me. There was the volcano and the earthquake, and she fell, and then the sound of her scream would echo in his next nightmare, he was sure of it. Put her on. Jean picked up the laptop and tried to point the camera at Audra's sleeping form. I can't. She's asleep. Look, she's injured and it's just us on the island until the ship returns. I need to know what happened to her, because she won't let me help her. The Aussie's expression grew flinty. If Audra says not to touch her, then you don't fucking touch her. I'll send help. He ended the call before Jean could respond. Send help? Did the man even know where they were? Help was 3 days away, in the shape of the investigator. Not some strange Australian thousands of miles away. Until then, it was up to Jean to keep them both warm, hydrated and fed. They had food and gas for the stove, enough to last them a week, plus whatever emergency supplies remained in the hut. He had enough fuel to power the generator for that time too, if he was careful. Water wasn't a problem, as long as it was above freezing outside and they had fuel to melt more if they needed it. There wasn't enough morphine for a week, but they might be able to stretch it out for another day or two if she took a lower dose. If they ran out before the ship arrived though, the withdrawal would be brutal. He knew that from experience. More than ever, he wished he'd never used the other bottle of morphine for himself. Maybe he would have been able to remember the day they met, so now they might have been friends instead of awkward colleagues, and she'd have told him about her past. Jean returned to the hut, which wasn't much warmer than outside. He could do something about that, at least. He switched on the ancient space heater left behind by some earlier expeditioner, and set about heating water for dinner. He pulled out the package of dehydrated food pouches. His mouth turned dry when he saw that the first one was Audra's favorite, mango chicken. He set that aside. She might want dinner later. Jean poured water into a different pouch and ate the lot without tasting a single bite. It's not that the meal was tasteless, the package said it was some sort of curry, but that his thoughts were on anything but food. First, he had an injured woman who was his first responsibility. Her even breathing told him she was still asleep and not suffering any ill effects from the drugs. But a broken arm wasn't life-threatening, and their ship was on the way to pick them up. Plus it would be light for hours, polar summer sure took some getting used to. He could just pop down the beach to that penguin colony and… But what if he found another sinkhole? Or he fell and broke something when the volcano caused another earthquake? There'd be no one to help him, and what if Audra needed him? He'd come so far to be so close and still not see them. This island had to be cursed. Ah, screw it. He'd sleep on it and make up his mind in the morning when Audra might be awake. Jean checked to make sure the stove and the heating was switched off before he climbed into his own sleeping bag, rolling so that he could see the sleeping woman on the other side of the hut. Was it worth it? Missing out on the most important part of his PhD research, just to make sure she was okay? Sure, he was disappointed, but it was nothing compared to the devastation he'd feel if something worse happened to her, and it was his fault. If even her broken arm was his fault, which it kind of was, seeing as he'd agreed to come to this end of the island instead of staying in the relative safety of Spit Bay. If he'd known this would happen, he'd have stayed there and not even considered a trip west to Atlas Cove. So he had his answer, didn't he? Yes. She was worth it. 43. Thumping woke Jean from a dream he couldn't quite remember. He hoped it wasn't a pair of elephant seals again, humping against the side of the hut. They'd nearly knocked one of the huts over last time, and as no one else had seen the seals in action, everyone had just thought he'd done a poor job of assembling the hut. When the truth of the matter was that no hut, no matter how well put together, could withstand the pounding of an elephant seal really getting into the action with his lady friend. He should tell Audra that story. Maybe it would make her laugh, or at least smile. He stared up at the foam ceiling. The hut didn't feel like it was shaking, so the thumping must be coming from somewhere else. Jean pulled on a coat and cracked open the door so he could stick his head through. Funny. Outside the insulation of the hut, it almost sounded like a helicopter. He glanced at Audra, but she was still asleep, so he dressed and headed outside to investigate. Jean almost didn't believe his eyes. A bright red helicopter sat in the clearing where last year's camp had stood. Eric emerged from the hallucination carrying a stretcher Jean recognized. He'd woken up in one on the cargo plane to Christchurch. How did you get here so fast? Jean stammered. Eric looked grim. The Aurora Australis is on its way to Fremantle for repairs. Once we got close enough to fly here and back to the ship on one tank of fuel, they dispatched me to collect her. Where is she? Audra. He'd come to take Audra away. Jean's heart constricted in his chest, but he managed to say, "She's in the emergency hut." She was asleep when I left though. Eric nodded and led the way. Between them, they strapped her sleeping body to the stretcher and carried her to the helicopter, where Eric secured the stretcher further for the flight. When Eric looked satisfied, he climbed into the pilot's seat. "Is that your boat?" he asked. "My boat?" Bewildered, Jean peered in the direction Eric pointed. The boat, which had floated away yesterday while he'd been busy taking care of Audra, was now beached on the rocks, between two seals. "Yeah. You should tie it up more securely than that. One good wave will sweep it right out into the cove, and I wouldn't want to swim after it." There were a pack of orcas around Wharf Point, trying to get to the penguins. "His penguins?" Jean sighed. "Not his penguins anymore." "Sure. I'll get right on it." He headed for the boat. The vessel had taken on a bit of water while it had been off sailing on its own, but it had lost pretty much everything else, including the anchor and the ropes he'd tossed inside it yesterday. His notebook was gone too, but then he hadn't had time to write any notes yesterday before he'd given up on research altogether, so he could help Audra, who was now flying away from him, perhaps forever. He raised a hand to wave at the helicopter as Eric took off. Not willing to waste time searching for the anchor that was probably at the bottom of the ocean by now, Jean grabbed the side of the boat and dragged it up the beach beyond the high tide line and tipped it upside down. The engine had probably drowned overnight, so he'd best leave it for a bit before trying to start it. He didn't want the engine dying on him in the middle of the cove. Besides, he had to radio the investigator for check-in and tell them he was still alive, like Audra usually did most mornings, right before she delivered her daily weather forecast. Shit, he was going to miss her. 44. Audra waited for the helicopter to stop rising before she let the pilot know she was awake, and had been for some time. "I wondered," he said. "I'm not sure if you remember me, but I'm Eric. You're the girl who does the videos. You've watched them?" "Yeah, we all have. It's cool to know what's going on at the bases, and the Antarctic Division's been sharing them on their website." He paused. "When we heard you needed help, the guys and me changed the route a bit so we'd be able to swing by and pick you up. I'm lucky I'm the only pilot this trip, so I got to fly you." "Why is there only one pilot? I thought there were usually more." "We're working with a skeleton crew this trip, because the ship's damaged and needs repairs." "Which ship?" Audra demanded. "The Aurora Australis, of course. After she broke her moorings in that storm off Mawson, she hit an iceberg. Didn't go all Titanic though, so once the shipping company had sent out some seaworthiness assessors, they said we could sail her to the shipyard in Fremantle. All non-essential personnel got sent back to Mawson, and they'll fly everyone out who needs it. So you're our only passenger this trip." "I didn't hear anything about it." "Wow. That must have been really scary." Eric shrugged. "We got off lightly. She's due for retirement anyway, and no one got hurt. It's not as bad as a volcano and a broken arm, like you." Audra winced as her arm twinged. "I guess Antarctica's really throwing her worst at us this year." "Ah, how long until we reach the ship?" "Just that the pain drugs I took at Herd are definitely starting to wear off, and I'd really like some more." "There's a first aid kit beside you. There should be something in that to help." Audra checked the box. "Paracetamol. Ibuprofen. Codeine. All pills that could probably take the edge off, though nothing as powerful as the morphine she'd taken yesterday. Got any water to wash these down with? Eric passed a water bottle over his shoulder. It was a stretch, but Audra managed to grab it with her good hand. She swallowed whatever the recommended dose was of all of them, then debated whether she wanted to sit up to see out the windows or if she was better off lying down. If she could undo the straps on the stretcher one-handed, of course. Pain wasn't going to be her only problem. What if they wouldn't let her return to Antarctica because of her broken arm? She'd been looking forward to the long, dark winter. Hell, she'd even bought a new dress in Melbourne for the midwinter dinner. Do you think they'll get the Aurora Australis fixed in time to finish the winter resupply run? Audra asked. Broken arm or not, if there wasn't any transport, she wouldn't be going back to Antarctica until spring. Doubt it, he replied. I heard they're talking about getting one of the French or American icebreakers to do it instead. Otherwise, they'll have to fly stuff into Wilkins. Some of the supplies are still aboard our vessel though, so they can't make the trip until we've unloaded everything and shipped it over to Hobart. So there was a way back to Davis. Audra breathed a sigh of relief. She only needed to convince the doctors that she was fit enough to be on that ship. 45. Back at McMurdo, Jean was surprised to find how alien all the American accents sounded to him after so many weeks among Aussies. So how was Heard Island? Did you get to meet the penguin weather girl? Heidi, one of the astrophysicists he remembered from last year, asked. Jean's head hurt. The what? Heidi laughed. The penguin weather girl. She's a meteorologist working down here, but her video channel makes Antarctica sound like paradise, instead of hell frozen over. In her last video, she said she was on the same team as a penguin researcher on Heard Island, so I thought of you. Do you know what happened to her? His blood turned to ice. What happened to her? Well, that's it, isn't it? None of us know, and she hasn't uploaded a new video. Talk about a cliffhanger. She's got half the world wondering and the other half are guessing who her mystery man is. Audra had been taking videos all over the place, but Jean had thought she was doing it to send home or to entertain her friend who kept pestering her with video calls. Could she really have a video channel? And what had she said about him? I don't know about any videos, he said. Can you show me? Heidi shrugged. Sure. She swiped and tapped her tablet a few times, then handed it to him. Here. That's the one she released a week ago. She hit play. A familiar Aussie voice came from the tablet. Hi. Welcome back to Heard Island. If you're watching this. Just the sound of Audra's voice made Jean's heart melt. He watched her show off Heard Island, before she pointed the camera at him. The barely recognizable figure waved at her from the boat, but he couldn't hear his own shouted warning about the volcano. What he saw next made his breath catch in his throat. Penguins. Dozens of them, milling around just like he remembered, but behind the adults, in a depression hidden among the rocks, she'd found the creche where they kept the juveniles. Audra was an angel. How many people have seen this? Jean asked urgently. If the whole world knew about his penguins, then his paper wouldn't be as groundbreaking as he'd hoped. Heidi angled the tablet so she could see the screen. Oh, about 8 million or so, which is why everyone's speculating about what happened to her. Jean skipped back in the video so he could watch the baby penguins again. He had to thank her. Personally. Properly. Somehow. So do you know her? And do you know what happened? Heidi pressed. She broke her arm. A passing ship airlifted her out and took her back to Australia, Jean said. Heidi looked crestfallen. Is that all? So why hasn't she posted another video then? Realization dawned. Because when she broke her arm, she asked me to keep her camera safe. I've still got it. He'd found it in his coat pocket the day she left, so he'd carefully packed it with the rest of her things, and they were all sitting in his quarters now, waiting for him to find a way to get it all back to her. Seriously? So you do know her? I'll have to watch the videos again and see if I can spot you in any of them. Heidi looked ready to burst with joy. Ooh, I fly out tomorrow. I can take the camera with me and put it in the post when I reach New Zealand. No, Jean said immediately. I wouldn't know what address for you to send it to. Plus, he intended to be on tomorrow's flight out, and the next flight to Australia after that. He might not know her address, but he could meet the icebreaker in port and be there when she disembarked. He needed to thank her and return her things. But more than that, he needed to tell her things. About feelings and how empty he was without her, and how, if she'd let him, he wanted to keep her safe always. But before he did that, he needed some answers. And he knew exactly who to ask. 46. Once the ship's doctor had set her arm, Audra flatly refused to stay in sickbay. Jody, the doctor protested, but I'd really like to keep you under observation just in case. I'll sleep in the same bunk room as you, but I'm not sleeping here, Audra interrupted. Last time I was in this ship's sickbay, it was my first time as an emergency medic, and the patient had 2 shattered legs. I don't want to remember that, thank you. Reluctantly, Jody agreed, but only if Audra wore a sling that kept her arm secure across her chest while she was aboard the ship. If the ship ran into a storm, she didn't want Audra to risk doing even worse damage if her injured arm hit one of the bulkheads. When the ship ran into a storm, Audra amended in her head, as she accepted the sling. Not staying in sickbay meant taking less potent pain medication too, but that could only be a good thing. The withdrawal symptoms after only 1 dose of morphine were bad enough. Anything worse would put her back in sickbay where she didn't want to be. Jody showed her to her sleeping quarters, then asked Audra to join her in the mess hall for lunch. Audra almost drooled at the selection of food on offer. She hadn't eaten anything that didn't come out of a dehydrated food package in weeks. She eyed off a particularly mouth-watering chicken parmigiana, until she realized she couldn't cut it with her right arm out of action. Reluctantly, she chose the stir-fry instead. Jody sat with her. I didn't realize you were the first responder to that American last year. He's Canadian, Audra corrected. And I wasn't really. They didn't have a medic aboard the ship at the time, so they picked me up from Davis to help out until he could see a real doctor at Casey. Me. I spent last summer at Casey, and this summer at Mawson. Jody took a bite of her chicken. I remember him. He was a mess. I haven't seen anything that bad since I was working the emergency department as a med student, and a guy got run over by a truck. So do you know what actually happened to him? Audra swallowed a well-crunched Snoopy. Well, it wasn't a truck. He fell down a sinkhole on Heard Island. The place is riddled with lava tubes, and he went through the roof of one. He said he had to swim out and drag himself up the beach to an emergency hut to call for help. Jody gave a low whistle. Wow, no wonder he looked so bad. By the time he arrived at Casey, I couldn't get anything sensible out of him. He kept calling me darling, or at least that's what I thought until I tried to contact his next of kin. Turned out his wife's name was Darren. He thought I was her, and he was muttering about a baby. He even tried to kiss me once. She laughed. Morphine makes people loopy, all right. Audra managed a smile in response, but beneath it her mind churned. So did that mean he hadn't been trying to cheat on his wife when he'd grabbed her? He'd honestly believed she was the faraway Darren when he'd tried to get her into bed? It didn't excuse him, of course, but it matched better with his behavior ever since. It made him less of a dirty cheating bastard who tried to force women to sleep with him and more of a, well, normal bloke who'd been away from his wife too long. If it weren't for his wife, Audra might have reconsidered her resistance to his kisses on Valentine's Day. She might even have welcomed more. As it was, Audra sighed. She'd probably forgive him for mistaking her for his wife, and in the unlikely event that she ever saw him again, she'd thank him for taking care of her when she broke her arm. After all, he had carried her quite a way. Whoever she was, Darien was one lucky woman. She'd married a real live romance hero, and Audra hoped she appreciated what she had. 47. Hi, this is Jean Pennant from McMurdo. Can I speak to Shelley, your chief meteorologist, please? Jean waited for the woman at the other end to send someone searching for Shelley, but instead, his call was transferred almost immediately. Hello, this is Shelley, she answered on the second ring. Hello? Ah, this is Jean Pennant. I'm a biologist. I was at Davis at the beginning of the season before heading out to Heard Island. He felt silly being such a coward and not blurting out his questions straight away, but he couldn't risk pissing the woman off and not getting any answers. Her tone turned wary. I remember you. Audra's roommate. A dangerous pause stretched before she added, so how is she? Jean sucked in a breath and blew it out. She broke her arm. Yeah, I saw that. On the video. I also saw you were there. He smiled mirthlessly. So someone had recognized him as the red blob in the boat. Yes. It's about that, really. She wouldn't let me perform first aid. Do you know why that might be? He'd bet his entire PhD scholarship that she did. Well, it's hardly surprising, is it? Jean froze. From the blasé way she spoke, it sounded like everyone knew about Audra's abusive past. Everyone but him, of course. I guess not, he said slowly. I mean, it's obvious someone's hurt her. She wouldn't say who, though. It almost sounded like Shelley snorted. She's too nice sometimes. But I'm not. I have no problems naming names because no woman should have to go through what she has. So name them then, Jean challenged, dying to know. I don't have to. It's all there in the video she took. Shelley sounded smug. Jean only knew of one video. The penguin one, he guessed. Bingo. She'd said something about her abuser in the video? He'd have to watch it the whole way through instead of just the baby penguins. Ah, can you remind me, he ventured. That was definitely a snort. Why, have you forgotten already? That's convenient. I wasn't there for all the video, he defended himself. I was out in the boat for part of it, and I haven't watched it all. Not the video, you idiot. On the ship. The day you met her. He'd hurt her. Was Shelley mad? There's no way he would have done anything to hurt Audra. He just didn't have it in him to hurt a woman, let alone do something that would leave her that scared that she'd refuse medical assistance. I don't remember anything of my time aboard the Aurora Australis that first time. Not Audra, not anyone. I was sedated on Heard Island and I woke up in a cargo plane, he said, desperate for her to believe him. I couldn't have, I wouldn't, I? He stopped. Protesting wouldn't get him answers. He'd done something and he needed to know what so he could make it right. Please tell me what happened. So Shelley repeated the story Audra had told her, omitting no details to spare his feelings. Jean had been a right asshole, he knew that now. It explained why she'd been so shocked to see him in her sleeping quarters at Davis, why she'd cringed away from their kiss, why she wouldn't let him touch her in that hut. It was a wonder Audra had deigned to speak to him at all instead of having him arrested for what amounted to attempted rape the day they met. Somehow, in his drug-addled brain, he'd mistaken the meteorologist for daring, and in his clumsy attempt to give his imagined ex-wife what she wanted, he'd ruined his chances with Audra. Now, more than ever, he had to see her, if only to apologize and try to make amends for what he did. He thanked Shelley and ended the call as politely as he could. He had a plane to catch, and he had to find out where on earth the port of Fremantle was, because Audra's icebreaker would dock in just over a week's time. 48. Audra smoothed down the skirt of the dress she felt was way too formal for the deck of an icebreaker, or walking through the port city of Fremantle. She looked like she was dressed for a date, not for a doctor's appointment and a bunch of X-rays. She didn't have a choice though. Her only other clothes were more suited to Heard Island and not a hot March day in Western Australia. "I'm almost jealous," Jody said. "That dress looks so much better on you than it ever did on me." "I'll wash it and give it back to you as soon as I've picked up some of my own clothes from home," Audra replied quickly. She'd made one phone call as the ship arrived in port, telling her family she'd be in Perth so she'd be home for dinner. "No, you keep it. It never fitted me anyway." "I'll pay you for it then. Transfer the money through when I next get to a computer," Audra said. "If you like." Jody gestured for Audra to go first along the gangway to the wharf. It felt strange to set foot on dry land again after weeks at sea, but Fremantle was as familiar as it had ever been. Fishermen lined up along the wharf, while a tourist in a souvenir cap topped with a garish kangaroo sat watching them from a bench in the shade of a crane. Audra breathed in the smells of home, and they were both strange and welcoming. She'd been away too long. "Come on, I called us a cab," Jody said, pointing. Audra followed her to the taxi, but her attention wasn't on the directions Jody gave the driver. Instead, her eyes were fixed on the outside world and everything she wanted to leave behind to return to Antarctica, if Jody cleared her to go back to work. Audra drifted through the X-rays and tests, answering some questions and letting Jody handle the rest. They'd been through this already on the ship, so none of it was new until Jody said, "This is healing nicely. Let's get this cast off and replace it with a brace." That perked Audra up. "You mean I'll be able to shower properly again?" Jody laughed. "Sure. Oh, which color would you like?" Faced with a choice between camouflage and a bright polka dot print, Audra picked the dots. "They'll show up well against the ice," Jody said. Some time later, her arm feeling much lighter in her new brace and sling, they rode back to the wharf in another taxi. "So what's the verdict?" Audra asked finally. "You'll probably be wearing that for 3 months while you're on restricted duty," Jody began. Audra's heart sank. "So they'll probably give me a desk job in head office? So much for the midwinter dinner." "I don't see why. Being the station meteorologist is mostly a desk job anyway. You'll be restricted from doing most of the chores though, and the rock climbing wall will be off limits." Jody grinned. Most people would be happy to get a head office posting instead of wintering at one of the stations. "Are you feeling all right?" Audra breathed again. "I am now. Thank you. It'll be my first winter out there, and I've been told what to expect, but I've been looking forward to it. Maybe next summer I'll change my mind." Jody paid the driver and helped Audra out of the taxi. "Now let's go get our stuff so we can abandon ship and head home." "Yeah." Audra looked up at the icebreaker, saddened at the thought that she wouldn't be traveling back to base on it. A new ship and a new adventure awaited, or maybe even a cargo plane if Eric's predictions were true. Then someone called her name. Audra scanned the wharf, looking for the source. Jean rose from the bench where he'd been sitting, pulling off his kangaroo cap. "I wasn't sure if it was you before, out of your expedition gear." Jody asked softly whether Audra wanted her to stay. Audra shook her head, so Jody headed up the gangway and out of sight. "What do you want?" Audra addressed Jean. Then, what are you doing here? I need to talk to you. Audra didn't respond. About what happened on the ship. He paused, then added, the day we met. What happened on the ship the day we met? I don't want to talk about it. In fact, I'd like to forget it ever happened, Audra replied, taking a step toward the gangway. Wait. Please. I need to apologize. That got her attention. Why? After all this time, why do you suddenly need to do it now? Audra asked. Jean cleared his throat. Because I only just found out last week. At her snort of disbelief, he continued, I honestly don't remember anything about that ship. He jerked a thumb at the icebreaker. I passed out in an apple hut on Heard Island and I woke up in a cargo plane. I know it's no excuse, but I was so out of my mind with pain and drugs that I don't remember anything in between. Audra wasn't sure whether to believe him or not. You've lived and worked with me for months. Have I ever not apologized when I've done something wrong? Straight away, he asked. One example stood clear in her mind. You didn't apologize for that kiss. He managed a sad smile. That's because I'm not sorry I did that. It was an awesome kiss. Best Valentine's kiss I've ever had, bar none. Audra blew out an angry breath. Men. They were all alike. Cheating, horny bastards who only wanted to get into her pants. She turned away. Please, Audra, wait. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for trying to force you to sleep with me on the ship. I'm sorry I didn't apologize the moment we met at Davis. I'm sorry I didn't remember the day I met you. And I'm sorry for any pain or trauma I caused you. I've never done anything like that before, and I never want to again. I'm sorry. You see, I must have thought you were your wife, Darren. I know, Audra interrupted. She stared into his anguished eyes for a moment before she nodded. Don't worry about it. But I hurt you. I swear I never wanted to do anything to hurt you. Shelley told you, didn't she? Audra read the confirmation in his expression, so she went on, I didn't tell her everything. Jean's eyes implored her. Tell me. Tell me exactly what happened, and then tell me what I can do to make it up to you. I'll even buy you lunch while you do it. Audra nodded and led the way to one of the nearby cafes. Though she wasn't really hungry, she ordered something off the menu and sat down with Jean at one of the indoor tables, where there was air conditioning. She took a sip from her drink and told him everything. From finding out she was needed on the ship, to leaving him in Jodie's care at Casey. His eyes widened in surprise when she told him how she'd stabbed him, and that's when she believed him. Believed that he really didn't remember any of it, and that his apology was sincere. A sudden thought occurred to her. Did I do anything while I was on morphine? Anything that I don't remember? Jean drained his drink and gestured for the waiter to get him another one. You snored? Audra smacked his wrist. I do not snore. He seized her hand. Her good hand. All right, if you say so. Sea ice eyes met hers, and Audra was momentarily lost. Mesmerized. How could such icy depths seem so warm? What are you doing this afternoon? Jean asked. I'd planned to see if I could find any fresh mangoes and eat as many of those as I can without being sick, then pick up some clothes to wear before going to dinner at my parents' house. Jean stared. You mean this is your hometown? Yes. Can I come with you? Audra hesitated. Why, she said finally. Jean lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. Because I enjoy your company and I've missed it. And because if this is your hometown, you know it way better than I do. Without you, I'll be lost. He's married. Audra screamed at herself in her head. He's married, and it doesn't matter if he looks at you like that, he's not yours. She yanked her hand back. Maybe. First, I need to figure out what I'm going to do about money, seeing as I left Heard Island without my wallet or phone or even a spare pair of socks. I can help with that. I've got all your gear in my hotel room, Jean said. Like that didn't sound dodgy at all. He continued, I've got your camera too. I really think you should. Can you get them for me? Audra interrupted. What, you mean go through your stuff to find your wallet and phone? He looked stunned at the idea. At least he hadn't pawed through her underwear. They're in a pocket just inside the main section, sort of zipped to the back of the backpack. You just have to open it and you'll see it, Audra said. Or you could just come up and get whatever you need. He eyed her curiously until realization dawned in his eyes. You don't trust me. After what I did when we met. I guess that's fair. I'm still willing to do anything you say to make it up to you for what I did. Just get me my things. He gave her a mock salute. Yes, ma'am. You want to come sit outside the hotel while you wait, or do you want me to meet you back here? Audra wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. Where's your hotel? She asked. Jean pointed. Over by the fishing boat harbor with all the seafood restaurants. A short walk from the wharf. Okay then, Audra said, gesturing for him to lead the way. But instead of heading for the sprawling heritage building near the cafe strip, he turned toward the fishing boat harbor. Audra held her tongue until after they'd crossed the railway line and were approaching some of the seafood restaurants before she asked, Are you sure you know where you're going? Yeah, he responded cheerfully. It's over there by the water. Audra didn't remember any accommodation past the fishing companies. Surely it was just the seawall protecting the harbor. Was Jean sleeping aboard a boat? Right near the end of Mews Road, where Audra could see nothing between her and the open ocean, Jean turned left. This one's mine, he said. To her surprise, he pointed at a row of two-story apartments that Audra had never seen before. They didn't look new either. I didn't even know these were here, she marveled. Want to come up after all? The view's great from the balcony. Still she hesitated. She'd shared a room with him for months and he'd never laid a finger on her. They'd shared a hut on isolated Heard Island, and he'd had plenty of opportunities to cause all kinds of trouble. Even on the coldest nights, he'd never suggested sharing a sleeping bag, though she'd seriously considered it. It had been cold at night without her hot water bottle. Damn it, it was the middle of the day in her hometown with plenty of people about. And she wanted to see the view. Yeah, I'll come up, Audra said, following Jean up the stairs. 49. This was a mistake. She didn't even like him, Jean told himself as he strode up the steps. She hadn't looked happy to see him, though it was a relief that she looked healthier than the woman who'd flown out of Heard in a helicopter. But she had accepted his apology, which was a start. Maybe she just needed time to warm up to him, after believing him to be an asshole for so long. Or maybe this was a huge mistake, and he should leave before he caused her any more trouble. He pointed to her bag, then headed out to the balcony. That way he wouldn't have to watch her leave and walk out of his life forever. He'd just hear the door shut and... I found my wallet and phone. Audra stepped out onto the balcony beside him. Everything in that bag smells awful though. It's been weeks since I did any washing and it shows. There's a washing machine here and a dryer, Jean replied. I have a big box of laundry powder too. I used a lot to wash my stuff when I first got here, but there's still plenty left if you want it. He'd wash it for her if it meant spending more time with her, and he usually hated laundry. She looked thoughtful for a moment, then said, If you let me do my washing here, I'll do my best to be your tour guide for the afternoon." He didn't hesitate. "Deal." Water soon cascaded into the washing machine full of Audra's clothes, so it was her turn to hold up her end of the bargain. True to her word, Audra walked him through the century-old prison, then took him to see the remnants of a 400-year-old shipwreck in the Maritime Museum. When they walked out of the museum, Audra suddenly stopped. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply and threw her arms wide as if to embrace the breeze. "Oh, the Fremantle doctor," she said in what Jean thought sounded like a moan of longing. A mental image of her moaning in pleasure flashed through Jean's head, distracting him. Yes, he wanted that. So much. Baby steps though. First, he had to persuade her to like him. It took a moment for her words to register. "You need to see a doctor?" Jean asked. Audra laughed. "No, I've seen enough doctors this week. The Frio doctor is what we call the afternoon sea breeze. It blows away the summer heat and makes everything wonderful." The smile on her face was definitely wonderful, Jean thought, but didn't say. Instead he said, "Where to next?" "The markets. I need those mangoes." Jean followed her into the markets, through the crowded stalls of souvenirs and all sorts of goods. Soon he had a collection of odd items to send home to his parents, while Audra blissfully swung a bag of fruit by her side. "Now all I need is a knife," Audra said. "Plenty in my kitchen if you want. Use whatever you need while I shift your clothes into the dryer," Jean suggested. To his shock, she accepted his offer. Swearing under his breath, he dragged the tangle of wet clothes out of the washer, and battled to get it all into the dryer. A couple of socks made a bid for freedom, but he added them to the drum before he switched the dryer on. When he returned to the kitchen, he found Audra had sliced up several of the mangoes, and was partway through dissecting a chunk of watermelon. "You'd have made a good biologist," he commented, eyeing her precision with the chef's knife. Audra laughed. "No, I wouldn't. I don't have the patience for it. And the dissections, ugh, no thanks. Not to mention collecting dung samples, or baiting traps with all sorts of disgusting things. I like the weather much more." She blushed. "And the weather has a power to it that I just can't resist. Plants and animals just don't leave me with the same awe." Jean nodded. He understood. The only time he'd ever felt awe around any animal was when they'd encountered a pod of whales last summer. "What about whales?" "Okay, I'll give you that, but there aren't many jobs for whale biologists unless you work on one of Japan's scientific whaling vessels." Audra scooped up the watermelon slices and set them on a plate. "I think I bought too much. I hope you're hungry." He helped her carry the food out to the table on the balcony, waiting for her to choose a chair before he sat in the other one. "I know they're not exactly awe-inspiring, but penguins are still important," he began. "They're an essential indicator species of climate change." "I know," Audra interjected with a grin, popping a piece of mango into her mouth. She swallowed, then said, "You've told me a few times. You're passionate about your penguins and your research, which is why I'm still wondering why you're here." Green eyes gazed at him over a slice of watermelon. He swallowed. "I told you already. I came to apologize. And to thank you. That last video you took on Heard Island helped my research more than you know. Right now, you're at the top of my list of acknowledgements for my thesis." "Ah, thanks. But you could have just sent me a copy. It'll make interesting reading while I'm waiting for the computers to come up with the next weather forecast." "I will." This was where he was supposed to talk about feelings, wasn't it? "I wanted to see you. I missed you, and it might be a long time before I see you again. And I wanted to thank you in person." He sounded so stupid he would have walked out. Audra didn't though. Her lips turned up in a tiny, enigmatic smile. Yeah, you said that too. And now you've done both, so mission accomplished. Whereas I have to be at my parents' house in just over an hour for dinner, so I should probably get going. No. Don't go. He wanted to grab her and say the words out loud, but then he'd just look like a bigger idiot than he already was. Can I come? He blurted out instead. 50. Audra's jaw dropped. Jean wanted to meet her family? Why? This could only end badly. Then again, that might be a good thing. The way he'd mumbled and repeated himself made him sound like a shy teenager trying to work up the courage to ask her out. Instead of a married man who should know better than to do any such thing. Audra wet her lips. My family isn't particularly wealthy, and my father lost his job when the mining boom ended. You're probably better off having dinner at one of the seafood restaurants here. Jean shrugged. My family's not rich. I'd rather have dinner with you than eat lobster alone. His eyes widened. Or do you mean they won't have enough food for all of us? I could buy something and bring it along. He was so close to the mark, but Audra didn't want to admit it. Actually, I'll be picking dinner up on the way. There's a pizza place near their house. If she didn't, there was no guarantee she'd get dinner at all. So how are you getting there? He pressed. She hadn't thought of that. It wasn't like she had a car anymore. Taxi? I have a rental car. I can drive you, Jean offered. I'll put your bag in the trunk, and I can drop whatever's in the dryer off tomorrow. Unless you want to take it now and dry it at home. I mean, it's not home. The moment Audra said the words, she knew they were true. She hadn't been here in almost 2 years. Broome, Melbourne, Davis, even Heard Island, all those places felt more like home than her family's crowded state housing handout. She might not have a permanent place of her own right now, but Davis was home for as long as she was posted there. And yes, you can drop things off tomorrow. My parents don't have a dryer, and the neighbors nick things off the line if you don't watch it. So you want me to come? He asked eagerly. Yes. The answer surprised her, but it wasn't about Jean. Not really. Her family would be on their best behavior with a stranger there, and her brothers would be less likely to ask her for money. Of course, he'd leave after dinner to go back to his hotel room while she stayed in the tiny room she'd shared with her sister since Sam was born, but it would only be for a few nights until she flew out to Hobart to meet the ship taking her home. It wasn't such a hardship. After all, she hadn't seen her family in ages. Sure. But I'll have to order you an extra pizza, Audra said. What would you like? Jean shrugged. I don't mind. Whatever you recommend. Do you know how long it's been since I had fresh pizza? Audra tried not to laugh. About as long as me, I imagine. She made the call, placed her order, and zipped up her bag, ready to go. Then she reached for it with her right hand and realized her mistake. She was going to have to pretend to be a frail female and ask Jean for help. Hey, I'll get that, Jean said before she could ask, slinging her backpack over his shoulder like it weighed nothing. Thank you. She tried to make the words sound as grateful as she felt. As she climbed into the passenger seat of Jean's hired hatchback, Audra realized she couldn't have driven it even if she wanted to. One arm wasn't enough. She directed Jean south, feeling a strange tightening in her tummy as the stacks of the refinery came into view. Not far now, she said, hoping the pizzas would be ready by the time they reached the place. Anything was better than cold, though. Jean looked stunned when he saw the stack of boxes waiting for them. How many people are in your family? He asked. I have 3 brothers and a sister, plus my parents. All of the boys will eat a pizza each. Maybe more. Besides, it's always been the rules in my parents' house that whoever's up first the morning after pizza night, they get to eat the leftovers for breakfast. Cold pizza for breakfast? Jean looked ill. Audra laughed. Of course not. Heated up in the microwave. It was usually me and Sam up first, because I'd have to work. Sam's one of your brothers? Jean guessed. No. Samantha is my little sister. She's in year 12 this year and she wants to go to university like I did, but she hasn't decided what she wants to study yet. Audra expected him to be bored, but Jean waved for her to continue, so she did. Tarders, we call him Tad, he lost his job about the same time Dad did, and he's been depressed about it for as long as I can remember. Occasionally he gets a new job or an interview for one, but it never lasts long. He has the worst luck. Benedictish is an apprentice electrician. He's actually not too bad, but he's had his tools stolen a few times, which means he can't work until he buys new ones, which he really can't afford on an apprentice's salary, so it's taking him longer than normal to finish his apprenticeship. Leonas is my youngest brother. He was born after me but before Sam. Leon had a nasty car accident a few years ago. He had head injuries and nearly died, but he hasn't really recovered from it. So if he says anything strange, it's because of his brain trauma. It sounds like your family's had a run of bad luck, Jean said, his eyes on the road. Not all of us. Not Sam and not me, Audra said. He glanced at her. A broken arm isn't bad luck? Getting accepted into the graduate program, being selected to go to Antarctica twice, being part of a South Pole expedition and a trip to Heard Island, where I got to see a volcano erupt, all those are incredibly good luck, Audra said. She waved at her polka dot brace. This doesn't even start to even it out. I'd have to break both my legs too. She stopped when she saw his white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. He barked out a harsh laugh. Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been so lucky with my scholarship and all that my accident was just the universe trying to keep things balanced, but it tipped things too far the other way. I guess that means I'm due some really good luck soon then. Audra had never heard him sound so bitter. You'll get your PhD. That's a good thing, right? I guess after 3 long years it's sort of lost its shine. Yeah, I'll get it, but after all the hard work it doesn't feel so important anymore. My plan was always to finish my PhD, then take a postdoctorate or teaching post at a university. Settle down and have a family. Audra's blood ran cold. A family with his wife. That's what he meant. She had to remember that even after spending a lovely afternoon with him, he was nothing more than a work colleague. One who was married to someone else. 51. Jean expected a lot worse than the house Audra identified as her parents' one. Sure, the garden was mostly dead weeds, but so was the rest of the street. The beaten-up car in the front yard made him wince though. Was that the car your brother crashed? Jean asked. One of them, Audra answered through gritted teeth. The first one he left at the crash site. That one used to be mine. He borrowed it without my permission while I was working in Broome, and did that to it. Jean swore. What did your parents do? Audra swallowed. Nothing. It's Leon. What kind of parents let a boy wreck his sister's car without some sort of punishment? Jean fumed. She was a graduate, barely out of college, with probably a huge debt to pay off and not exactly a high-paying job to do it on. If she hadn't needed the car, she could have sold it to help pay off her loan. If her brother didn't have the money, then her parents should have done something. Come on, let's get these pizzas inside before they get cold. Audra's tone had turned dull and lifeless, much like the dried weeds crunching underfoot. Jean grabbed the boxes and followed her to the front door. She knocked several times before someone finally came to the door. I thought I heard something, but then I thought, nah, it's too early. So good to see you, a female voice exclaimed. The screen door clanged open and a girl with bright green hair threw herself at Audra. Jean strode forward to intercede even before Audra let out a pained yelp. "Careful! She has a broken arm," he boomed, bringing his own arm up to shield Audra's from her overzealous sister. To her credit, the girl backed off. "How did you do that?" "It was a volcano," Audra began shakily. The girl didn't let her finish. "A volcano? There are volcanoes in Antarctica?" Audra described Heard Island to her sister as they followed her inside. Jean tried to keep his expression neutral as he surveyed the interior, which had definitely seen better days. Better decades too, seeing as the decor looked like they'd picked the color scheme before Audra was born and not done anything to it since. "Where do you want me to put these?" Jean asked, lifting the stack of boxes. "On the dining table," Audra and her sister said together. They both laughed, then the sister said, "I'll get some plates." As she leaned over to extract them from the kitchen cabinet, she hollered, "Oi! Audra's here and she brought dinner." 3 men marched into the room and made a beeline for the table. They each picked up a pizza box, ignored the plates, and headed for the front room. Not one of them said a word to him or their sisters. Jean felt his anger build. She'd been away for months and even bought them dinner. What kind of family didn't say hello or thank you? They hadn't offered to pay her back for the pizzas either, and those hadn't come cheap. Someone should have picked her up from the port, instead of letting her find her own way here. Did they just take her for granted so much that they'd stopped caring for her? It just wasn't right. Audra deserved better. So much better than this. Audra didn't seem surprised. "Where are Mum and Dad?" The girl rolled her eyes. "At the state housing office again. They sent a nasty letter, saying they didn't have as many kids anymore, so they didn't need a 4-bedroom house. Because I'm the only one who's still a kid, they're only entitled to a 2-bedroom unit. So they took all the doctor's reports for Leon and Tad and all the paperwork from welfare and Ben's apprenticeship, and they're trying to convince them that we do need this house, otherwise they'll need to find a new place for Leon and Ben and Tad and a new place for us, and they're saying the waiting list is a couple of years." Audra nodded. Bloody bureaucrats. There was no venom in her tone, just tired resignation. She gestured toward the table. "Have something to eat, Jean." He was as bad as they were, taking her for granted. First out on Heard Island and now here. He should have paid for dinner, not her. Too late now. Feeling both girls' eyes on him, he took a plate and lifted 2 slices from the nearest box. Then he was lost. Are we sitting at the table or joining them? One glance at Audra's polka-dotted arm gave him his answer. He might not have done enough to repay her kindness before, but he could start now. "I'd prefer to sit at the table if that's all right." The girls nodded, then made their own selection. Audra slid into the seat on one side of him, while her sister took the other. "Who's he then?" the sister asked through a mouthful of pizza. Audra swallowed. "This is Jean, a biologist who was working with me at Heard Island. Jean, this is my sister Sam." Sam's eyes were more golden than the green of her sister's. "What are you doing here?" Audra said she'd show me around for a bit while I'm in Fremantle, so she invited me along to dinner to meet her family, Jean said. "How long are you staying?" "I fly out in a few days." At this, Audra slumped slightly in her seat. Did that mean she was relieved, or disappointed? Or just tired? "I'll be right back," Sam said, jumping to her feet. She hurried out of the room. Jean looked askance at Audra, who just shrugged. One of her brothers sidled into the room. He jutted his chin at Audra. "So, when are you going to pay to get the car fixed?" She slumped down further in her seat. "I already told you I'm not Leon." "But I need it for Letitia," he whined. Then save up your dole checks and buy your own car. Audra sounded bone-weary. But that's not soon enough. If you give me the money, I'll pay you back. I just need $5,000. Davo down the road has this sick Skyline that needs a new engine, and he only wants a couple grand for it. Couple grand for the car, couple for the engine and a new paint job, and I'll be able to get Letitia back. His eyes glowed. Come on, sis. Don't you already owe her for the damage you caused to the car out front? Jean asked, annoyed. Wasn't me, Leon whined. And who the fuck are you? Stupid yank. Audra clamped a restraining hand over Jean's arm. Jean's my friend from work. And he's Canadian, not American. Same difference, the boy sneered. Go on, sis, give me the money. I know you got it. She's still not giving it to you, Jean snapped. The boy backed down a little. You her boyfriend then, telling her what she can do with her money? Jean had had enough of this little punk. Yes. And we're saving for a house, so we need every cent we earn for the deposit. Including the money you owe her. Under the table, he crossed his fingers. He'd be gone in a matter of days and she could tell them whatever she wanted then. Leon turned his belligerent eyes on Audra. That true? Audra swallowed. Yes, she said softly, then more loudly, yes? It is. Were you buying then? If Mum and Dad lose this place, we can all come and stay with you. There's a new housing estate being built just south of here, near the beach. That'd be good. Jean barely managed to suppress a shudder. Christchurch, in New Zealand. It's a lot colder than here, but it's closer to Antarctica. He slipped an arm around Audra's shoulders and felt her stiffen. It's what we both want. The front door clanged open and an older couple walked in, looking just as tired as Audra. Oh good, dinner, her father said, helping himself to some pizza, while Audra's mother rounded the table to give Audra a hug. Her mother held out a hand to Jean. You must be Audra's boyfriend. I'm Jolanta. Too late, Jean realized he still had his arm around Audra. I'm Jean-Pierre. He shook hands with the woman. I headed up the Heard Island expedition with Audra for my PhD research. She nodded with what Jean hoped was approval. Not bad. Audra's dad stuck out his hand. I'm Lucas. I hope you have better luck getting Audra to settle down than we have. She spends far too much time and money traveling around, when she should be saving it. Jobs can vanish like that. He snapped his fingers. Audra shrugged off Jean's arm. Dad, I've only been traveling for work. They pay me for it. Which reminds me, I should get some of my summer clothes while I'm here. I only brought winter ones with me, and they're too hot for March. She rose and disappeared in the same direction her sister had gone. Jolanta settled into Audra's seat. So Jean-Pierre, what sort of research do you do? 52. Audra stepped into the bedroom she and Sam had shared for more than 15 years and didn't recognize it. Where is everything? Sam glanced up from her computer, Audra's old laptop. When you moved out, I bought a desk at the local op shop and the boys helped me move your bed out so I could fit the desk in here. What about my clothes? Audra asked, opening the wardrobe door. Nothing inside was hers. The boys moved your stuff to the garage. Even the boxes I sent from Melbourne? Audra persisted. Sam nodded. Everything. You know how cramped it used to be in here. If I'd moved out first, you'd have spread out too. Audra's mouth was dry. She'd counted on staying here tonight, but there was nowhere for her to sleep. It wasn't home anymore. Her words from earlier come back to haunt her. The garage. Right? She strode through the house, managing a smile for Jean and her parents as she headed for the back door. The garage was full of spiders and junk they didn't want anymore. Her books, her clothes, everything she owned that wasn't at Davis was now in the garage, if one of their dodgy neighbors hadn't stolen it. Audra flicked on the light, holding her breath, as she worried about what she'd find. She exhaled in relief as she spotted the 2 boxes of clothes she'd mailed from Melbourne last spring, looking a little dusty but still sealed. Underneath those, it was a different story. A collection of water-stained boxes and garbage bags that hadn't been there before filled her with dread. Waiting would only make matters worse, she told herself as she reached for the nearest bag. She laughed when she realized it held nothing but tinsel. Not her things at all. None of the bags held her stuff, she discovered, which made her turn her attention to the boxes. A little water probably wouldn't have damaged her clothes, but her books were a different matter. Cautiously, she opened the first one. It was mostly full of books, except for a couple of items of clothing on top. Smiling, Audra pulled out the ball gown she'd worn to her Year 12 formal. She'd been the only girl in white, and while she hadn't won Belle of the Ball, she knew she'd looked good. She hadn't gained much weight since then either, so it should still fit. Audra held the dress up against her and looked down. A deep purple blotch spread across the fabric, like someone had spilled wine or ink down the front. A quick glance at the box told her the culprit, the dark cover of a book that had evidently been soaked through at some point in the past, bleeding through her dress until it had killed that too. Letting the ruined dress slip from her fingers, Audra dropped to her knees, desperate to check her books, but the further down she got, the worse they became. Covers had run and bled, pages pulped together until the books resembled papier-mâché bricks. Textbooks. Fiction books. Her high school yearbook. Her family had left her most precious possessions out here in the rain to rot. A tear trickled down Audra's cheek, followed by another. She swiped them away. It was just stuff. It didn't matter. Not really. Except that it did. It really, really did. Hey, are you all right? Jean's voice cut through her self-pity. Audra rose, praying that it was too dim in the garage for him to see her tears. She nodded. I'm fine. I was just looking for a few things, and I think the roof might have sprung a leak, because some of them. More tears filled her eyes and she had to stop talking to focus on blinking them back. Jean's eyes landed on the open box. Hey, is that your high school yearbook? That did it. Audra burst into tears. Jean's strong arms encircled her, pulling her against his chest. Safe. She felt safe. For the first time in how long? Too long. Since he'd carried her in his arms on Heard Island, her memory piped up. Carried her and protected her and cared for her like no one else had. Gradually, Audra became aware of Jean's voice, murmuring, "It'll be all right. If there's anything I can do, just tell me. I'll help. I swear I'll help. Anything. Just tell me." Audra choked back a sob. I can't stay here. I need to go. And I need to take anything that isn't already damaged, before it gets wrecked too. What do you need me to carry? She pointed at the Melbourne boxes. Just those two. Consider it done. He hefted one in his arms and carried it through the gate to his car, followed by the other one. Anything else? She wished there were, but Audra shook her head. That's all. Do you want to head back to Fremantle, to the hotel? Jean asked. She could sleep in a hotel. It wouldn't be cheap, but it was only for a couple of nights. She could afford it. Audra nodded. Jean offered her his arm. Let's go say goodbye to your family then, and I'll drive you back. You've had a rough day and I bet your arm hurts. He was right. Perfectly, wonderfully right. If only he wasn't already married to someone else. Audra smothered a sigh and headed inside with him. It was time to say goodbye. 53. Jean parked the car outside the hotel and they both got out. Audra began, "Thank you for..." "Want to come up for a drink?" he asked. "I know what it's like to have your past stuffed into a garage for storage. Forgotten. Only one step away from going into the garbage, like you don't matter anymore when you do." Audra sighed, dropping her gaze to the pavement. "I want to, more than you know, but I really shouldn't. We're both adults, capable of making our own decisions. What your family thinks about it doesn't matter," Jean said. She bit her lip. "But what about your family?" She raised her eyes, which were full of hurt. "What would your wife say if she knew you were asking strange girls up to your hotel room for a drink?" Jean barked out a laugh. "My ex-wife lost the right to say anything about what I do with my life the day she filed for divorce. When she shoved what remained of my possessions into boxes that she hid in a garage. That'd be about 2 years ago now. So if she did have anything to say, it'd be along the lines of how it's about time I moved on, seeing as she's remarried and all. They've got kids too. Twins." Audra gaped. "You're divorced?" He managed a smile. "You know, I think this is the first time I've ever been happy about it." "Yes. I'm divorced. I was already divorced the day I fell through a sinkhole on Heard Island and broke both my legs. I was divorced as I swam through a lava tube and across Atlas Cove back to camp, chanting my ex-wife's name like a mantra because, like the fool I was, I believed she loved me as much as I loved her, and that she wanted me home. I was divorced the day I first met you on the Aurora Australis, though I don't remember it, and I was divorced for the months I spent recovering in New Zealand while the doctors and medical staff did their damnedest to get me to walk again. But I didn't know until I arrived home in Vancouver and walked into my ex-wife's house, to find her married to another man and carrying his child. Children even." Tears sparkled in Audra's eyes. "But why?" "I never did ask her that. I figured it was too late to do anything about it, by the time I found out." As he stared into Audra's eyes, Jean realized he'd made a mistake in not asking. "Maybe I should. I don't want to mess up that badly again. Especially not with you." He pulled out his phone, thanking whatever powers of the universe had made sure he had Darren's phone number for this moment, and made the call. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. "Hello? It's Jean. Please, Darren, don't hang up. I know you don't want anything to do with me anymore, and that's fine, but I have the right to know why." Darren sounded uncertain. "Why?" "Because I've met another woman who means the world to me, and I don't want to make the same mistake twice." Jean saw Audra's eyes widen, but he plowed on. "You don't even have to talk to me. Tell her. I'll hand the phone to her, so you can say whatever you like. Darren, my ex-wife, this is Audra." He thrust the phone at Audra. Audra gingerly took it and placed it by her ear. "Ah, hello? I'm Audra." 54. "You're Jean-Pierre's new girlfriend?" an Irish voice demanded. Audra was momentarily tongue-tied. She'd expected a Canadian accent like Jean's, not an Irish one. "Ah, not yet. I thought he was married until about 5 minutes ago. I just asked him what happened to make you divorce him, and he called you." Darren laughed. "So he's still a coward, is he? Doesn't like a direct confrontation. Still walking away from his responsibilities. All right, I'll tell you, and it'll serve him right when you break it off too." Audra stiffened, not liking Darren at all. Perhaps divorce had been a lucky thing for Jean. Audra wet her lips. "Thank you," she said, forcing herself to be polite. After a moment's thought, she hit the speakerphone button so Jean could hear her too. "Jean-Pierre Pennant walked out on me to follow a dream. I told him not to call me and not to come back if he meant to go to the arse end of the world and leave me alone. He left, so I filed for divorce." Jean nodded, his eyes downcast. But was that all? Audra persisted. Was it such a crime for a man to follow his dream? To go out and do what it took to get his PhD in one of the most hostile environments on Earth? What do you mean, was that all? He promised to take care of me. To get a job where we could live near my family. To give me children. Darren insisted. But while he was following that dream, he was bettering his education, so he could get the sort of job where he could take care of a family. Audra wanted to scream at the woman. I would have given her all those things if she'd let me, Jean said softly. It was only one more year to wait, until my doctorate was done. Selfish, that's what he is. He'll do the same to you, Darren continued, as if she hadn't heard Jean. Did he cheat on you? Audra persisted. I'll say he did. He may have married me, but he gave his heart to those birds. Those bloody birds at the bottom of the world. Bestiality with a penguin? Didn't the woman know how bad they smelled? A burst of laughter threatened to escape, but Audra managed to smother it in time. I mean, with a woman? Or a man? Are you trying to tell me he cheated on me with you? Darren demanded. Audra drew a deep breath. No, I'm not. I didn't meet Jean until after you were divorced, or so he tells me. Their first meeting loomed in her mind, pushing her to ask the question worrying her the most. Did he? Was he ever violent toward you? Darren laughed again. That coward? He wouldn't hurt a single living thing. Not even bugs in the house. Instead of killing spiders like any normal person would, he'd catch them and carry them outside so he could release them. Besides, if he'd dared raise a hand against me, my brothers would have killed him. Audra's breath hissed out in relief. Thank you. You're welcome. And I'll tell you something else for free, so you don't make the same mistake I did. Jean-Pierre Pennant isn't worth your time. One day he'll be telling you he loves you and wants to give you the world, but the next day, he'll be gone chasing a bird or some more letters after his name. If you make him choose between the birds and you, the birds will win. So save yourself some heartache and run while you can before you start believing his lies. He loves himself and his precious research first, and you'll be lucky to come a distant second. If you turn your back for just a moment, he'll run off to the ends of the earth to chase some new discovery, leaving you high and dry. Don't let him do it to you. The faint sound of a baby's wail came through the phone. That'll be Thomas. I have to go. Run, you hear me, girl? Run while you can. Darren ended the call. Audra handed Jean back his phone. She's right, he said sadly. I'm just a PhD candidate now. And then there's my postdoc, which could be anywhere. Biological research involves fieldwork, and I chose a field where. Audra pressed a finger to his lips to silence him. I have one more question for you. How many girls have you invited to share your room for the night since you married her? Jean swallowed. One. Just you tonight. He paused. And no men ever? Audra laughed softly. I think I will come up for that drink. And maybe whatever else you implied in your invitation. Jean held up his hands. I'm only offering you drinks, I swear. Audra met his gaze squarely. Well, after tonight, I think we both need a drink. A big one. 55. Jean keyed open the apartment door, gesturing for Audra to enter first. Without waiting for an invitation, she seated herself on the couch. We both know she's wrong, right? The door slipped out of Jean's fingers and slammed harder than he'd intended. What? When you had to decide between me and your research out on Heard Island, you chose to help me instead of continuing to count your penguins. Even when you knew it might be your last chance to finish your research. The selfish asshole your ex-wife described wouldn't have bothered to help me. At least he wouldn't have until he was finished with his task. And you're not a coward either. Audra took the shot glass Jean handed her and gulped the contents. And choked. Jean leaned forward to pound her on the back. You okay? Fine, Audra said, coughing. It's that god-awful whiskey again, isn't it? Jean nodded. Cost me a damn fortune, but I'm not going back to Antarctica without it. Audra nearly choked again at his words. You're going back. Just like she said. We had to make a few concessions to get me a spot on this year's Heard Island expedition. One of them involved me spending the winter at Davis as its botanist, taking care of the hydroponics. My research supervisor said it would give me plenty of time to finish my thesis without distractions. He met her eyes. I fly out in 2 days. That's why all I can offer tonight is drinks, because you deserve so much more than a one-night stand. I know I can't ask you to wait for me, but... Enough of the self-sacrifice shit, bird boy. Women can spend the winter in Antarctica too, you know. And I'm willing to bet you a whole bottle of that horrible whiskey that we'll be on the same flight south. But your arm? Jean floundered. Audra held up her brace. Broken. Yep. But fixable. And it's not enough to get me out of the work roster back at base. The boys on the icebreaker told me the only reason they brought me here to Fremantle is because they were due here for repairs and didn't have time to detour to one of the mainland bases to drop me off. They're shipping me back on the next flight south so Shelley can go home. I'm the winter meteorologist at Davis Station this year. She smiled. I get a nice pay rise for it too. Would you like a roommate? He ventured. Audra's smile widened. That depends entirely on how good you are in bed. Jean swallowed. Rusty, he admitted. Me too. They stared at each other for a long moment before Jean broke the silence. If we're spending the whole winter together, we should take things slow. I mean, you're injured, and I never ever want to hurt you. Plus, it's been so long that I've probably forgotten how to pleasure a woman properly, if I ever knew. Audra scrunched up her face. So maybe we should start with something simple. Like kissing? Kissing is never simple, Jean said, shifting to the seat beside her. The moment has to be just right, and so much depends on doing the right thing at the right time. First your lips touch, then they move together until you're sharing each other's very breath. And then... Audra laughed. You talk too much. Only when I'm scared or nervous. I don't believe a man who could swim across Atlas Cove with 2 broken legs, among seals and killer whales and all sorts of things, radio for help and then do first aid on himself is afraid of anything. Let alone some graduate meteorologist with a broken arm. The beautiful, talented meteorologist I'm deeply in love with, Jean corrected. Audra blushed. You missed intelligent. And besides, how can you know you love me when we've barely even kissed? He reached out and pulled her against him, careful not to touch her injured arm. Oh, I know. When I heard you scream, those penguins could go screw themselves for all I cared. I couldn't lose you. She lifted her good hand to caress his face before she kissed him. Azorella-colored eyes regarded him as her tongue invited his out to play. It felt as natural as breathing to kiss her back with as much passion as he could muster. Breathless. Lost. Found. He'd swim the Southern Ocean for this woman. Or just kiss her forever, if that's what she wanted. I love you, Audra, he gasped out. She smiled. I'm fast falling for you too, if I haven't already. You're one up on me. I've never fallen in love before and you have. What I had with her was nothing compared to this. Jean waved at them both. One kiss. More, he insisted, drawing her closer. Faint music came from beside Audra. Damn, that's my phone. Jean drew back. Go on, answer it. Hello? Audra listened for a moment, before she hit the speakerphone button. Jay, how did you know I'd even answer my phone? Because you're not online and I saw from your ship's webcam that you're in Fremantle now, so you have phone access again. Good. Because I need your advice. Stalker? Jean mouthed. Audra shook her head. Did it occur to you that I might not be online because I'm busy? Of course not, Jay scoffed. You got injured and needed to be evacuated. Isn't that enough to get you sick leave? Audra bit her lip and met Jean's eyes, trying not to laugh. There are other kinds of busy, Jay. Fine. Whatever. Just tell me what to do and you can get back to whatever you were doing. Audra's breathing became deliberately even. Be quick then. Jay took a noisy breath. I'm certain of it now. I'm in love with her. And I can't lose her, but I don't know what to do. I helped her with stuff like you said, but I don't think she even noticed. I invited her to the wedding and she's promised she'll dance with me. But if I tell her how I feel, I might lose her anyway, because she'll tell me to fuck off if she's not interested. What do I do? Audra didn't look like she had a ready response for him, so Jean leaned over and said, Dude, if you really love her and don't want to lose her, do whatever you have to do. If it means carrying her across a beach and fighting off about 50 rogue elephant seals, that's what you got to do. A long silence followed by, Who the fuck are you? Sorry, Audra whispered, then in a normal tone she continued, You remember my roommate Jean-Pierre? I'm sure I told you about him. And he's right, you know. Your roommate fought off elephant seals for you? Jay demanded. He's the guy who picked you up in the video, isn't he? What video? Audra asked. Jean cleared his throat. The one you were taking when you fell. Oh. Audra's brow creased. How did you see it? You streamed it live, Jay said. It was like a TV show ending on a cliffhanger when that guy picked you up and then the feed went dark. He coughed. I might have panicked a bit there. Jean snorted. Her rock star friend would have been lost out there. That's why he thanked his lucky stars he'd been the one on Herd Island with Audra. Who knew that cursed island better than a man who'd nearly died there? That's how I knew what ship you were on, Jay continued. I did what you told me not to. I linked the video on my social media accounts and asked people to find you and tell me you were okay. One of the biggest rock stars in the world, the uncrowned king of social media, had told the world about Audra. That explained how her video had gone viral. You diverted an icebreaker to pick me up? Audra squeaked. Jay, I only have a broken arm. Sick bay at any of our bases could handle something so simple. I was worried. Jay protested. And you're only angry at me about the ship, right? Not the video? What video? She didn't know half of the world had seen it, Jean realized a few seconds before Jay did. I should go, Jay said. Have fun with your roommate. He hung up. Audra turned to Jean. Do you know what he did? I do now, he replied, reaching for her phone. He pulled up her video channel and showed the latest one to her. Everyone at McMurdo had seen it, and Davis. Because your friend shared it, the video went viral. Audra peered at the screen. 9 million views, she whispered. Not even Flavia's videos had been that popular. You're famous. She didn't look happy. Can I hole up here until we fly out? Absolutely. I'll sleep on the couch, so you can have the bed. We could share the bed, you know, Audra said. I wouldn't mind. So tempting. He'd been right to call her a seductress, but she did it effortlessly. Almost like she wasn't aware of her appeal. I screwed up when we first met. Just because I was off my face on morphine isn't an excuse. I owe you better than that, he said. He nodded at her brace. What if I accidentally bumped you in the middle of the night? I don't want to hurt you. Her shoulders slumped. Fair enough. It'll be a while before I'm ready for a good night kiss though. My body still seems to be on Herd Island time. I crossed so many time zones to get here, my body doesn't know what time it is. Want to watch a movie or something? Audra nodded. Jean flipped through the hotel's selection of on-demand movies. 2 chick flicks, a horror movie from a franchise that had grown tired 2 movies ago, and an X-Men movie that must have come out while he was in Antarctica. What about this one, he asked, hoping against hope that she wouldn't pick one of the chick flicks that Darien would have insisted on. Sure. I haven't seen that one. Had she even glanced at it? You like superhero movies? Jean asked. Of course, Audra answered. They're like romance novels, the bad guy never wins and there's a happy ending. Jean shook his head. Comic books and superhero movies are the complete opposite of romance books. Have you ever read one? Of course not. Audra smiled. Well, I like both. Unless you do your research, you don't have enough data to draw conclusions. The chances of you being good in bed are getting slimmer and slimmer if you've never read romance. Her tone might be teasing, but her words could be all too true. That hurt. Maybe I'm terrible in bed and that's why she left me, Jean said, stabbing the button on the remote control so the movie would start. They watched in silence, sitting side by side on the sofa, but they may as well have been in different worlds. Jean wasn't sure what to say to bridge the abyss between them either. Things had been going so well until he'd suggested the movie. Had he picked the wrong one? Want to watch another one? He asked when it finished. I think I saw. Audra covered a yawn with her hand. I think I'm going to go to bed. Can you help me undress? Ah. He couldn't say no, could he? It's not like he didn't want to undress her. He dreamed about it. The medic on the ship helped me dress this morning. She was really helpful. If I was at home, I'd ask my sister, but seeing as I'm here with you. Audra's eyes begged him. I figure you've seen me naked before. It's not that big a deal, right? No. Yes. Fuck. Those dream tits would be his undoing, and he knew it. Yeah, I'll help you. Jean followed her into the bedroom, watching her edge her dress up one-handed until the hem revealed a pair of pink cotton panties. He'd have expected something sexier from Audra. As if she could read his mind, she said, I didn't have a change of clothes aboard the ship. Only what I was wearing and what they could dig out of the lost property box. All my underwear is back at Davis. There should be some in the dryer here, Jean replied, trying to distract himself as he helped her pull the dress over her head. The bra she wore wasn't something out of lost property, he was certain. Her breasts filled out the cups like it was tailor-made for her. He itched to take it off so he could cup her in his hands and... Audra turned her back. Can you unclip my bra, please? Jean swallowed. Sure. He did as he was bid and held his breath as she slid the straps down her arms. Now she wore nothing but those childish pink panties. Audra turned to face him again, and Jean forced his gaze to stay on her face. No lower. No matter how much he wanted to. I just want to say that those are the most perfect pair of breasts DNA ever gave a woman, Jean blurted out. I should have said that the first time I saw them. Audra gave a sad smile. I've heard that line before. Well, except the DNA bit. That's new. Probably because it's true. And any man who's lucky enough to see them, who didn't tell you that, is an idiot. Still he held her gaze, because to look down was to be utterly, utterly lost. "I'd like that goodnight kiss now," she said. 56. Audra took a deep breath. "And I'd like it with your shirt off, please." What was she thinking? She'd never taken the lead with a man before. But his admission that he cared about her, even loved her, had made her brave. That and the compliment about her breasts. Jean nodded and pulled his shirt off. Audra feasted her eyes on the muscles that hadn't diminished since the first time she saw them, more than a year ago now. Strong enough to carry her to safety. Caring enough to comfort her when she cried. Gentle enough to pull her close like now, and passion ignited as his lips touched hers, as if their Valentine's kiss had lit a fire that still smoldered under her skin. Her nipples snapped to attention as they made contact with his chest, just as eager as the rest of her for his touch. She wanted. No, she needed. Audra barely noticed as her back hit the bed, with Jean half on top of her. Warm fingers stroked her breasts, giving her nipples the attention they so desperately craved, as her tongue tickled his, begging for more. His mouth moved south, bestowing a dozen kisses along her throat as he descended on her breasts, to kiss her 100 times more. "Oh yes," she moaned, wrapping her arms around him to hold him tighter. "Oh how?" Jean jumped off the bed, his arms raised in surrender. "What did I do wrong?" "Nothing," she breathed, cradling her injured arm. "It was me. I got so caught up in the moment that I tried to pull you close with both arms, forgetting this one's out of action." "Well, I'm sorry. Sorry I distracted you so much, you forgot you were hurt. You need to take care of that arm so it heals properly." Jean jerked his head toward the living area. "I'll make up a bed on the couch for myself, so I won't be far away if you need me." "We could still share the bed," Audra said. When Jean opened his mouth to protest, she held up her right hand. "I always sleep on the right side of the bed, with my arm on the edge. The only way you'll bump it while we're sleeping is if you manage to roll over the top of me and hit it just before you fall on the floor." "We should take it slow," Jean insisted. "This morning you barely wanted to speak to me. I don't want you to do something you'll regret. Especially when you're under the influence of pain medication. That kind of consent's questionable at best, and this morning I had to remind myself every few minutes that you were a married man who wanted to cheat on his wife," Audra interrupted. "And my pain meds wore off while we were at my parents' place. I need to take some more before I go to bed, because this is starting to seriously hurt." Jean fetched her a glass of water and her box of pills, then sat on the corner of the bed. "I don't want you to think I'm the sort of man who tries to drag a girl into bed with him on the first date." Audra almost choked. "Too late for that. Besides, we've never actually been on a date. We've lived and worked together for 3 months, and shared sleeping quarters for most of that time. Normal relationship rules don't apply here, because nothing between us will ever be normal, and I don't want it to be. Sleep with me while we're sharing this hotel room, and tomorrow I'll take you on a date. I'll take you to an island breeding colony of penguins, the like of which you've never seen before." Finally Jean laughed. "You want our first date to include penguins? I think if I wasn't already in love with you, I would have fallen hard the moment you said that. You're the perfect woman. And if you want, I'll sleep with you. But there won't be any sex between us until your arm's completely healed. That I promise you." "That's what you think," Audra thought but didn't say as Jean snuggled up behind her. He wouldn't last 3 days before he caved. 57. Audra sat back and stretched her arms above her head. It had been 3 months and she'd officially decided Jean was the stubbornest man alive. She told him so too. Not that it changed anything. Her nightly weather forecasts were as predictable as her evenings. Dark, well below freezing, with a high chance of a storm but zero chance of sex. Slowly but surely, she was getting to him though. For the last 3 months since they'd arrived back at Davis, they'd made out like teenagers, exploring and experimenting until he learned to read her body's signals so well she swore he worked magic with his hands and his mouth whenever he touched her. Audra hadn't been shy either, now she knew his body nearly as well as her own. Well, most of it, anyway. She'd never seen him without his blindingly white boxer briefs. The only exception had been that day at Penguin Island, when he'd traded his briefs for board shorts and ventured into the water with her. It wasn't until they'd waded in waist-deep that he'd confessed to his fear of the ocean after swimming across Atlas Cove last year. A fear he'd sworn to conquer today, and she intended to be there to cheer him on. As if on cue, her phone rang. "Are you ready?" It's taken the guys half the morning to cut through what turned out to be more than a meter of ice, but the midwinter pool is about to open. "Sure, Bruce. I've got my camera charged and ready to capture every moment," Audra replied. "Heading over from the Met station now." She left the computers compiling their data, hoping that when she returned they'd have done most of her work for her on the evening forecast. The midwinter pool was just the beginning of the Dark Days celebrations, and she'd agreed to be a part of it. She found Allie and John standing poolside in their heaviest outdoor gear, with Bruce carefully stirring up the pool surface so it didn't ice over until everyone had taken a dip. Everyone brave or crazy enough to, anyway. Audra lifted her camera and pointed it at the pool ladder. "It's the winter solstice here at Davis Station, so some of our bravest expeditioners have decided to celebrate with a swim. All right, who's first?" To her surprise, Jean emerged first, wearing the same red board shorts she remembered from Penguin Island, a pair of sneakers and nothing else. At 30 below zero, he had to be cold, but he grinned and winked at her before he slipped the safety rope around himself and climbed down the ladder into the icy pool. Audra saw him hesitate, but she didn't think anyone else noticed. It might be a dark day, but it was ideal for conquering the demons that had plagued him for so long. Jean met her eyes and nodded once. He knew what she was thinking. He pushed off into the middle of the pool and ducked under the surface of the freezing water before he emerged again, still grinning. "It's lovely," Jean shouted. "You should all take a dip." He was shaking as he ascended the ladder, but he could blame that on the air temperature. He staggered off to defrost, and Audra found herself filming the next crazy expeditioner. One by one her colleagues took the icy plunge until Bruce shouted, "Last call." Audra glanced at John. The doctor bit his lip, but he nodded. Audra passed the camera to Allie, explaining how it worked. Allie held it between her gloves like a piece of precious china. Audra shucked off her outer gear until she stood in nothing but her bikini and the safety rope. Fuck, but it was cold. She fixed a smile on her face and wrapped her hands around the ladder. How was it possible for the metal to be colder than the air? The water was the warmest part, she told herself, ignoring the ice floating in the pool. Jean had done it, no matter how terrified he was. She was just cold. Just like a day teaching swimming at the beach, when she'd had to show her class how warm the water was so they'd join her. Audra crouched on the ladder, then pushed off into a starfish float on top of the water. 2 minutes, John said, reminding her of the time limit. The human body could only withstand these sorts of temperatures unprotected for 5 minutes before things started to shut down. It felt so good to be in the water again, no matter how cold. She stroked across the pool toward the ladder, reluctant to leave the water. But there was more water waiting, warmer water too, and Jean. Her teeth clacked together as violent shivering racked her, but Audra still managed to get the words out. "Now for a dip in the hot tub." The midwinter spa, an inflatable pool the guys had rigged up with hot water just outside the station entrance in a sheltered spot out of the wind, held only 2 men and a woman, and none of them was Jean. Before she could ask, Leslie said, "He's gone inside." He said he had something special to prepare for the midwinter dinner tonight. Is it true you're going to stream it live on your video channel? The competition might be over, but Audra still posted at least once a week. The beginning at least, Audra said. I wanted to film the swim live too, but Ali said there'd be too much swaying for that. She was right, I'll have to edit a lot of it out before I post the video. Everyone laughed, which was perfect timing for Ali's appearance with Audra's camera. She filmed them in the hot tub for a minute, then switched the camera off. Where do you want me to put it? Ali asked. Audra waved at the SMQ building, where all the winter expeditioners now slept. Leave it on my desk. I'll download it when I get in. Leslie stared at Audra's arm. Hey, you're not wearing your polka dots anymore. Is that just for the swim or? Audra smiled. I got the all clear from the doctor this morning. No more polka dots. My arm is officially healed. Which probably puts me back on the kitchen roster. Leslie wrinkled her nose. Which reminds me I have work to do. Time to go back inside. Audra rose too. I should join you. I have a video to edit and upload before dinner. She needed to get her body back to normal temperature too, before she sought out Jean. 58. I don't know about you guys, but I'm going inside for some antifreeze, Paul said, hefting himself out of the hot tub. Jean was the first to follow him. He'd had his swim and now he deserved a drink as much as the next man. Besides, once Audra had finished filming, she wouldn't hang around outside. Idly, he wondered whether she'd have gone for a swim if the doctor hadn't insisted that anyone with an injury wasn't allowed in the water. A video of her in the water would definitely go viral, he thought, as he traded his soaked shorts for warm, dry clothes. Probably best that she hadn't then, Jean decided. He didn't want to share her beautiful body with the rest of the world. Especially not tonight. Midwinter was special, and he wanted it to be a memorable one. That meant only one drink at the bar, because he'd need his wits about him. Everything had to be perfect. He drained his beer and excused himself, telling the other guys that he needed to get things ready for tonight. They raised their drinks in salute and wished him luck. Jean knew he needed it. Part of him wanted to go hide out in hydroponics with the plants for a bit, but he knew he needed to find Audra and thank her for her help in persuading him to face his fears today. She wasn't in any of the living areas, so he headed for her sleeping quarters. Sure enough, she sat at her desk, frowning at something on her laptop. Jean knocked on the open door. Was I good enough to make the cut for your video? He asked. Her frown vanished as her whole face lit up. Hell yes. That was amazing. So brave of you. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him. Instant antifreeze, that's what she was, as his body blazed with desire at her touch. He wasn't sure how he'd managed to resist her this long. Even now, he could feel his pants growing uncomfortably tight. Every fiber in his body wanted him to tear off their clothes and thrust himself deep inside her. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not until her arm had healed. He kissed her with just as much passion as the first time, if not more. God, he loved this woman. More than anyone or anything else in this world. He slid his hand under her shirt, questing upward until he found what he wanted. One of her perfect breasts, quivering under his fingers as her heartbeat raced just beneath her soft skin. You're cold, he murmured between kisses. Audra grinned up at him. Well, it was cold outside, and I did stay out there for a while. The midwinter pool is only open for one day of the year. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. Let me warm you up. Jean kicked the door shut as he advanced into her room. He'd planned to do this much later in the day, but adrenaline still buzzed in his blood, egging him on to thank her properly now. Not later. She let him pull her to the bed, helping him divest her of her shirt and that bothersome bra. Those breasts. He could worship them for hours, and Audra would probably let him too, but he had other things in mind now. Jean dropped to his knees before her. "I know it's too soon," he began, feeling his voice crack with nervousness. How could this be scarier than jumping into icy water? He didn't know, just that it was. "But, Audra, I love you so much. Will you?" 59. Will you? Jean stammered. Oh hell, he was kneeling at her feet. He could only be asking her for one thing. Audra's mind went blank. Would she? Jean swallowed and tried again. Will you let me go down on you? It's something I've never done before, but I think I understand the theory well enough to do a decent job. Audra nearly burst out laughing. Yes, she cried instead, half out of relief and half in panic at not having an answer to the other question she thought he'd ask. With his help, she shimmied out of her jeans. Before she could add her knickers to the pile of fabric on the floor, he lifted her up and set her on the bed. He joined her, kneeling between her feet as he pushed her bent knees apart. The way he stared at her sent hot shivers deep inside her, where she wanted him to be. Soon. Tonight, if she had any say in it. She'd hook her fingers into those boxer briefs and drag them right down to his ankles, just like he was doing with her knickers now. For the first time she lay completely naked before him, and the blue fire in his eyes told her he liked what he saw. She glanced down. The tent in his pants confirmed it. He leaned forward, his face so close to her that she could feel his breath warm inside her when he exhaled. He traced her folds lightly with his finger, so light that it tickled. She shivered, and he ducked his head between her thighs. Next, she felt what could only be his tongue, rougher and more sure, following the same path as his finger. Slow and delicate, always exploring, always tasting. Using just that wicked mouth of his, he'd worked out that he could push her over the brink of an orgasm by working his magic on her nipples alone. When he tried the same technique lower down, she'd be utterly lost. The whole station would hear her scream. Jean must have felt her stiffen because he raised his head to meet her eyes, no longer teasing her. Did I do something wrong? Audra shook her head. The more you touch me, the more I want to feel you inside me. And the spot you're looking for, that you probably heard about in your theory? It's right here. She sucked in a breath as she touched his thumb to her clitoris. You are nothing like any other woman I've ever met before. Jean's thumb circled around the spot he knew drove her wild as Audra held her breath. And inside you. He pushed a finger slowly into her, watching her as she took quick, shallow breaths. He could make her come using just his fingers. Audra knew it, but she still wanted more. Please, she said. How can I refuse? With 2 fingers this time, he pulled in and out of her, his eyes never leaving hers as he maintained a slow, steady pace. How am I doing so far? Oh, it felt good. To finally feel any part of him inside her was better than good. But she wanted more, Audra moaned. Then his mouth was on her, and Audra could think of nothing else. There wasn't room for anything else in the universe except his body and hers, and the pleasure he gave her filled every inch of it. Of her body and her mind. Any more and she'd explode into a million tiny shards, flying in all directions like the blizzard she'd forecast for tonight. Oh, Jean. How long had she been sobbing his name? Long enough for him to be wearing his biggest grin. Jean eased his fingers out of her and licked them clean, before he took one last languorous lick of her lady bits, making her gasp. Did I do all right? He asked. I meant it to be a thank you for helping me find the courage to go back into the water today, but I enjoyed myself so much I got a bit carried away. His eyes widened in alarm. You're not crying, are you? Shit, did I hurt you? I knew I should have waited. I knew it. Audra seemed to have lost the ability to talk. Or to think, really. I'm fine, she started to say, but Jean cut her off. I'll see you at the dinner tonight, he said, hurrying out of the room. Audra sighed. To the ceiling she said, like I said, I'm fine. So's my arm. My tear ducts do this weird thing where I cry when I'm happy. Or if I have mind-blowing sex. Which was both until you left. She glanced at the arm brace sitting on the desk. Evidently she'd have to tell him the good news after dinner. 60. If he'd stayed a moment longer, he'd have completely lost control. Jean crouched in the corner of the hydroponics lab, hidden by the green things he grew to help sustain the station, and buried his face in his hands. She deserved more than the out-of-control asshat he'd been the day they met. He couldn't live with himself if he hurt her again. And he couldn't go through with his plans for tonight, even if that's where he'd pinned all his hopes and dreams for the future. He needed to get himself under control and do things right, or this wouldn't work. What if he'd used up all his courage on this morning's swim, so he chickened out of the most important part of the celebration? What he needed now was someone to tell him he was being an idiot, and he could conquer 2 fears in one day. If only the best person for the job wasn't Audra. Jean almost laughed at himself. If he had to ask her for help, he'd screw this up for sure. A light on his tablet flashed, so he reached up to the counter to grab it. Probably just a routine email. He was surprised to find it was an incoming video call from none other than Jay Felix. He still didn't know how Jay had managed to track him down, but Jean imagined a man with his wealth could do things ordinary men like himself could only dream of. Which made Jean only feel more inadequate for what lay ahead. Are all Canadians as crazy as you? Jay demanded before Jean could even say hello. Probably not, Jean admitted. You Aussies are corrupting me. If everything goes well tonight, you'll have to come up for a round of golf on the roof with me. I already told Audra she can have a villa on the island for a month anytime she wants, as thanks for what she did to help me win my wife. We could all go jet boating through the whirlpools. And whatever else we can think up that my lovely wife says is okay. Jay frowned. She might veto the roof golf, come to think of it. The rock star was married now, Jean remembered. Audra had showed him pictures in the news. Congratulations, by the way, Jean said. I think you broke the hearts of half the women in the world with that wedding. I know one that didn't break, Jay said. So did Jean, which gave him hope. She's really happy for you. For you both, I think. She said she met your wife once and she liked her. She's British, right? Yeah, but she's Aussie now too. Been here long enough. Jay's eyes narrowed. Don't distract me. I want to make sure you're not backing out. From thousands of miles away, this man Jean barely knew was reading his mind. Jean forced out a laugh. She turned you down. More than once, you said. What makes you think she'll say yes to me? Have you cheated on her? The question caught Jean by surprise. Of course not. What kind of man cheats on the woman he loves? Jay coughed. Yeah. Ah, she's still going to do that live video of the dinner tonight, right? I think so, Jean said. I'll be watching, Jay said. Me and probably a million other people who want to watch you propose to the penguin weather girl. No pressure, of course. He grinned and ended the call. Jean snorted. No pressure at all. The rock star and his million other people could watch and think what they liked, they didn't matter. The only person in the world who mattered was Audra. And Jay's talk of penguins had given him an idea. 61. Are we ready? Ali asked. Audra checked one last time to make sure her camera captured the whole table. It did. Satisfied, she took her seat, laying the remote control beside her plate so she could start recording on Ali's command. She absently smoothed the skirt of her dress, wondering once again if she'd dressed too formally for the occasion. A glance at the blokes, all clad in suits and ties, reassured her. Leslie and Ali wore dresses too, but still she worried that she'd been silly to buy silk when a simple cocktail dress would have done. But the pattern on the fabric, which reminded her of one of Monet's garden paintings, had caught her eye every time she'd walked past the shop, until one day, she hadn't been able to resist buying it. Jean hadn't said anything to her yet. In fact, he wasn't even here. "Where's Jean?" she asked. Everyone glanced around the table, as if expecting him to magically pop up beside them. All except Ali, who said, "He's been in the hydro lab for most of the afternoon, but when I last saw him, he was on his way to his quarters to get dressed." "Bruce, does someone want to go see where Jean is?" "I'm here," came the deep Canadian voice that made Audra's core clench. "Especially after this afternoon." Her breath caught in her throat as he came into view. Dressed in a suit, Jean could have graced the cover of a romance novel about kinky billionaires. One look at him and she understood the appeal. She wanted to leap into his lap and go to town on him like the sexiest secretary ever. "Take a seat here then." Ali pointed to the chair beside her and opposite Audra. Jean barely glanced at Audra. He turned his attention to Ali, who had risen. Audra hastened to switch the camera on. She was sure only Jay and the other expeditioners would be watching live, but she kept her promises. The midwinter dinner would be broadcast live, even if she was distracted by dirty thoughts about Jean. Ali launched into her speech, welcoming them all to the dinner and reminding them about the explorers who'd first come to Antarctica, and all the hardships they'd faced. She raised a toast to the darkest day, for it truly was the darkest day of the year. The sun wouldn't rise at all at Davis in June, it wouldn't even peek over the horizon until July. They all drank in thoughtful silence. "It might be the darkest day of the year," Ali continued, "but it's been a particularly bright year for us. So much light in the darkness." She made Jean stand up. "The first we heard about Jean-Pierre was when we got a request for an emergency medic. Audra volunteered and took good care of him all the way to Casey. No one thought he'd manage to pass a medical and return, but he surprised us all by turning up here at Davis on his way to Heard Island. Of course this time he took Audra with him." She waited for the laughter to die down before she went on. "He not only finished his PhD but he submitted his thesis in record time and it's been accepted, he found out this week. So first, I'd like you all to congratulate Dr. Jean-Pierre Pennant." Enthusiastic applause erupted around the table. It wasn't just polite either, people looked genuinely happy for Jean. Ali proceeded to go around the table listing each person's achievements, from academic and research milestones and projects completed, through to Leslie saving Bruce from an angry penguin that had popped up in the pool this morning. Leslie couldn't stop laughing but Bruce just looked embarrassed. And last but not least, even if she is the youngest here at Davis, there's Audra. Ali gestured for her to stand up, which Audra did. It's her first winter here, which she almost missed, after she ran afoul of a volcano and then took a cruise back to Fremantle, with the Aurora Australis. She graduated at the top of her class for her meteorology degree, which is why we welcomed her back here for her second tour of Antarctica. Her innovative new video project has been shared all over the world since she first called Davis home, and it's earned her both the coveted, inaugural Bureau of Meteorology Graduate Research Scholarship and a research grant from the University of Washington, where she's just been accepted as a PhD candidate studying the evidence of climate change at Heard Island. Audra blushed at such a paean of praise. Sure, it was all true and her PhD candidacy had only been confirmed this week, but it still sounded far too ambitious for a girl who'd been nothing but a hotel maid 2 years ago. Normally, this is the point where I'd officially open the dinner, but Dr. Pennant asked to say a few words, so I'll let him have the floor. Ali sat down. Audra tried to do the same, but Ali signaled to her to stay where she was. As Jean started to speak, Audra began to realize why. I came here 6 months ago chasing the only two things in the world that mattered to me, penguins and my PhD, Jean said. I already knew Antarctica was dangerous. It had nearly killed me once on my first expedition to Heard Island, but like many of the old explorers, I refused to be beaten. Some people called me dedicated. They were the polite ones. He pointed at Audra. She called me stubborn, and she was right, though I didn't see it at the time. It took a volcano and another accident to make me realize that there might be more to life than my PhD. Something more important than penguins. A few people laughed. She showed me things I'd never noticed before. Things I took for granted but I shouldn't have. I even learned a few things from her and from penguins. And she made me see that penguins alone will never be enough. More laughter. So here I am, in my penguin suit, about to do something no penguin in history ever has. Jean stepped forward, then sank onto one knee before Audra. Icy blue eyes regarded her, warm with love. When most penguins find a partner, they mate for life. For a long time I've been jealous of that, but it turned out I hadn't yet met my mate. I'm pretty sure I have now, and I want to be the first to ask her before some other penguin tries to muscle me out of the way. She's looking so beautiful tonight, I bet they're queuing up outside in the blizzard just to get to her. Even Audra laughed at that one. She tried to keep her breathing even, both hoping and dreading what he'd say next. At least now she had an answer for him. Jean cleared his throat. Audra, I love you and I always will. I promise to bring you fish whenever you ask, and mind any eggs we might one day have, while you go off to pursue your own career. I'll always help you take care of yourself, even if you never have another broken wing. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, whether it's here in Antarctica or anywhere else in the world you want to call home. Audra, will you marry me? Everyone, Audra included, was laughing too hard for anyone to hear her reply, so she had a moment to consider her words. Then silence descended over the party, and it was her cue to speak. Audra wet her lips. I'm not really ready to think about eggs just yet, and now my broken wing has healed, I hope I never break anything else again. Choosing a mate for life is a very big decision, and 6 months ago, I would have said it wasn't something I was ready to consider. As Jean's eyes widened in panic, Audra winked at him and he relaxed again. But fish on command, what more could a girl ask for? She raised her voice to be heard above the laughter. Yes, Dr. Pennant. I'd love to marry you. If anyone hadn't heard her, the way Jean joyfully jumped to his feet and kissed her probably gave them a clue. But while he kept one arm around her, his other hand reached for the camera to switch it off. Audra glanced at the grinning faces around the table. You all knew, didn't you? Was I the only one who didn't? Jean ducked his head. Actually, I wanted to do this in private, the moment I got confirmation about my PhD, but I'd promised your friend Jay that I'd ask you in front of the camera. After what happened earlier today, I hid out in the hydroponics lab, telling the plants and myself that I could do this. I was so sure I'd screwed up. Now wasn't the time to talk about tears or sex. One bit of good news Ali didn't mention is that I got the doctors all clear this morning. That means I'm officially not injured anymore. Jean nodded, loading his plate up with food. It took a moment for her words to register, and when they did, he dropped the serving spoon with a clang. Your arm's completely healed? No more light duties or taking it easy? It was Audra's turn to nod. So you might not want to drink too much with dinner tonight. I'm thinking of turning in early and I'd like the good night kiss you promised me. Not fish? Jean held up a platter of smoked salmon. Oh, I want my fish too, Audra replied, helping herself. So far, the darkest day of the year had proven to be the best day of her life. And it wasn't over yet. If this afternoon was anything to go by, the best was yet to come. 62. When dinner was finished and people were picking at the remains of dessert, Ali announced that she was off to bed. Everyone took that as the signal to disperse, heading off alone or in twos and threes for the bar, the pool table and the movie theater. "Shall we go?" Jean asked Audra, hoping she hadn't changed her mind. She seemed unusually interested in the proposed movie marathon. "Please," she replied with a roguish wink that hit Jean right in the groin. It truly was the best night of his life. Audra had agreed to marry him, and if he'd guessed right, the moment they got some privacy, the clothes were going to come off and what happened this afternoon would be nothing but mild foreplay. They'd make love for the first time with his ring on her finger. Jean glanced down and realized he hadn't given it to her yet. He'd been so caught up in getting his proposal right, that he'd left his box in his pocket the whole time. In the corridor outside their sleeping quarters, he stopped. "Wait. I forgot to give you this." He pulled out the box and flipped it open, preparing to drop to his knees again, but Audra seized the box before he could. "That's beautiful," she said. "I saw it in Fremantle while I was waiting for your ship to arrive. The emerald reminded me of the color of your eyes. I know engagement rings are supposed to be diamonds, but this is perfect," Audra said firmly, holding out her hand. "You should put it on me." Jean slid the ring onto her finger. To his relief, it fit. And looked like it belonged there. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her arms around him for a lingering kiss. Jean was this close to pinning her against the wall and having her right there in the corridor, but Audra deserved better than that. The whole station might know what they were doing tonight, but that didn't mean they needed to see it. "Your room or mine?" Jean managed to say. "Mine. Further from everyone else because it's on the end, and if we're lucky, no one will hear the noise we make over the blizzard." Jean liked the sound of that. The memory of her crying out his name this afternoon was still fresh in his memory, and he intended to make her do that a lot more before tonight was over. Good thing it was the longest night of the year. 63. Audra threw her camera on the desk, not caring where it landed, and gave Jean her full attention. To hell with decorum and professionalism and all that shit. She wanted him. Now. And there was nothing to stop them. Their next kiss made her knees weak, so she wrapped her leg around him to hold herself steady. His hands cupped her ass, pressing her groin against his, and she went wild, climbing him like a koala. Her legs circled his hips as her arms twined around his neck, their lips fused together like she wanted the rest of their bodies to be. He'd loosened his tie and the top couple of buttons of his shirt, making him look even more sexy in the suit, if such a thing were possible. God, he was hard as a rock between her thighs, and she rubbed against him like a cat in heat. She needed to feel him inside her. Now. "Condom," she panted, reaching for the box on the shelf. Pinching a foil packet between her fingers, she reached down to free him from his suit pants. She unzipped his fly just fine, but the belt needed 2 hands, so she gave up on it, delving inside his pants for what she wanted. Hot and hard and in her hand. Finally. She stroked the condom down his length, licking her lips in anticipation. Not that she'd taste him tonight, or at least not yet. Audra hitched up her skirt and tightened her legs around him, feeling the rough scratch of his wool pants against her thighs when all she wanted was that sleek shaft. So much. "Fuck me." "No," she said, pressing against him so that his tip entered her. Jean's eyes were on fire with lust as he pinned her against the wall. Or the door. She didn't know, and she didn't care. "I'm not going to fuck you," he said, sliding a finger inside her. "I make love to my fiancé the same way I will every night when you're my wife." His finger was gone and she ached for him. Any part of him. "Please," she whispered. With one smooth thrust he filled her completely. Perfectly. "Oh yes. Just like that, Jean," she moaned. It was like he'd been made for her. He picked up the pace as she urged him on, eager to feel her first climax with him inside her. Almost too soon she crested that wave, crying out his name as she flew over the other side into bliss. It took her a moment to realize what he'd been repeating the whole time. As he drove deep inside her with one final earth-shaking thrust, he said it again. "I love you." She loosened her legs from around his waist, moaning a little at the feel of him still inside her. She was shaking, but so was he. "I love you too, Jean. So much. I made you cry." "I never want to make you cry," Jean said, easing out of her. Suddenly empty, Audra found herself struggling to stand on her jelly-like legs. "Like I tried to tell you earlier, I cry when I'm happy. Really, really happy. Like when my fiancé fulfills my fantasy of having a quickie with a sexy man in a suit, up against the wall." She grinned up at him as she tried to blink away her tears. "See? Actually, we did it against the door." His eyes met hers and they both laughed. Audra wet her lips. "Maybe we should try it again and see if it's any better with the wall?" He glanced down. "Another time, maybe. I didn't expect to be spent so quickly for our first time. I'd planned something slower, more romantic, where I'd last longer." Frowning, he started to clean up. Of course he'd planned this. Audra was willing to bet his plans would be even more incredible than what they'd already done. She couldn't wait. "Then you're in charge for round 2, she said. Jean nodded. "So tomorrow, maybe, if you're feeling up to it?" Audra stared. "Tomorrow's hours away. If you haven't recharged by then, I'll deep-throat you myself until you're ready, and I never do blowjobs." She eyed him. Jean definitely wasn't small, but he wasn't enormous like Jay. Maybe she'd make an exception for Jean. Who was she kidding? If Jean so much as breathed a hint that he'd reciprocate with stellar oral sex like he'd demonstrated this afternoon, she'd be on her knees in a moment. His smile seemed sad. "I've never done it twice in a night. Lower sperm counts the second time, you see, so there wasn't really any point." Audra's heart melted for him. Jean's first marriage really had been a miserable one. Your first wife was an idiot. The point to sex is to enjoy it, and procreation's just a possibility afterwards if you don't take precautions. How could any woman not enjoy sex with an incredible lover like you? She never let me, never wanted. She wanted me to be quick, and she wanted kids. That was all. Jean looked uncomfortable. No wonder Jean hadn't been in a hurry to sleep with her. Being nothing but a breeder was no fun. And what a waste. Crazy woman. Audra took a deep breath. Well, I'm not her. And I don't want to talk about her ever again. Especially not tonight. Tonight's just for us. As for kids, I'm in no hurry to have them, if ever. I have an implant that's good for another 4 years, so maybe we can talk about kids then. Not tonight. I had plans for tonight too, you know. Jean perked up a little. Yeah. I'd planned to dress up, maybe dance with you a little after dinner, and then seduce your socks off. He cocked his head to one side. How were you going to seduce me? Audra grinned wickedly. When I got you onto the dance floor with your body pressed against mine, I was going to whisper in your ear that I'm not wearing any underwear. Jean paled. You weren't? You mean that whole formal dinner with the video and everything when I proposed to you? You weren't wearing underwear? Nope. Jean swallowed. I think I might be ready for round 2 now. Except this time I want to take some clothes off first. Oh yes. Audra wanted to squeal with delight. You're in charge. 64. Jean didn't want to be in charge. That was one of the things he loved most about Audra, the way she made sure they did things together as equals. Putting him in charge meant she was less than him when she was so much more. What if I lose control like I did this afternoon? Audra grinned and pushed him onto the bed, straddling his lap. Then the whole building's going to hear me scream for joy. Green eyes challenged him to do his worst as she ground against his groin. Bring it on, bird boy. He kissed her, claiming her mouth for all the wonderful things she said and the wicked things she could do with her lips and her tongue. Tonight, she tasted of mango, like the beer she'd finally admitted to giving him for Christmas. He shrugged out of his jacket, lost the tie and belt, and started working his pants down over his hips, while Audra took care of his shirt buttons. When she peeled off his shirt, leaving just his pants, Jean rose, lifting her up with him so his pants slid to the floor. He kicked them away, once again mesmerized by Audra's eyes as she stared into his. She slid a hand into the waistband of his boxer briefs. These better be coming off, she said, snaking her fingers around his shaft. Jean didn't need telling twice. He set Audra on the bed so she could watch. Down went the briefs, so he stood naked before her. This is what you get, he said softly. I hope it's good enough for you. If it isn't, I'll be hitting the gym in the morning so I can do better. Her eyes danced. What if I want you to do a different kind of workout in the morning? Here with me instead? Audra patted the bunk beside her. He sat beside her, pulling her back into his lap like she'd been earlier, only this was much better than before. Now all that lay between them was the silky fabric of her dress, and she was already hitching up handfuls of the skirt to help remove that. The way she sat astride him now reminded Jean of his fantasies of her, back on Herd Island. You need to be naked, he said, lifting the dress over her head so that her breasts popped free. All clothing cast aside, she was a dream come true, from her loving green eyes to the perfect breasts pressed against his chest, right down to her toes already curling with pleasure as she ground her hips against him. Shall I sheath you? She murmured. Condoms meant no worrying about kids or sperm counts or being quick. This would be sex for the sheer joy of it, his pleasure and hers. He dropped his voice to the devilish tone that hadn't worked on Audra before. Sheath me. It worked now. Her hand unrolled the condom along his length, but her eyes begged him for what he wanted most. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her at the same time as he surged into her from below. Audra gasped, then returned his kiss, giving his cock a squeeze as she clamped down on him. She met his second thrust halfway, dipping her hips to take him deeper. She rode him all right, with a fierce determination that took his breath away. She took as much pleasure as she gave, this incredible woman who was way better than any fantasy. He could feel his peak building, but he needed to see her come first. To hear her moan his name like there was no one else in the world, and no one else she wanted more. He felt her shudder as her muscles clenched around him before she sucked in a breath so she could cry, I love you, Jean. Oh, Jean. Only then did he allow himself his own release, lost in the blissful high of the woman who still clung to him, wrapped around him like she was made for him alone, when the truth was that he was made for her. To love her, to take care of her, and to bring her joy like this every moment they were together. Forever and always, through all life's adventures. This has been Made for the South Pole. Book 7 in the Romance Island Resort series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.